but it's a long-term game. They want their e-commerce division to get
So are they feeling pretty okay about a holiday shopping season? Because
yeah,
we're smack dab in it. Not that I've shopped yet, but I mean.
Yeah, holiday shopping is off to a strong start. So the interesting thing about the holiday season this year is that it's shorter than in most years. Thanksgiving is following later in the month of November. So the answer to that is that they trigger the deals even earlier than usual.
I can see all the sales coming in. Paul knows that I shop on the sales. Let's go to Lowe's, because that is interesting as well. That stock is off the lows of the session, but still down over 3%. What did Lowe's say?
So Lowe's shares fell before the bell, and quarterly comps were better than expected, but still declining. So high interest rates and a weak housing market means people are moving less than they were before. It means they're spending less on big ticket home renovations. But despite gloomy sales, Lowe's actually raised its forecast for the year, seeing positive growth in its professional business, so selling goods to contractors and builders, also in e-commerce, and spending on smaller ticket outdoor projects. Last week we saw Home Depot similarly say that the weather was actually a bright spot for its sales. So the hurricane led to higher sales for Home Depot. Warm weather meant that people were spending more on grills because the grilling season was getting longer. So in general, for these Lowe's, Home Depot, sales are down, but the outlook got a little bit better this quarter.
Where do we see the weakness in the consumers? Is it like in the dollar stores? Because I mean, again, I see a strong number from Walmart. To me, that is America. So where is the American consumer hurting? Is it, I guess it's even at a lower end than Walmart. Yeah,
the lower end is definitely suffering. The dollar stores are suffering. They don't offer the variety that Walmart offers. 60% of Walmart's business today is in groceries. And you can get you know, some pretty good stuff at Walmart these days, gluten-free items and organic produce and stuff that like you're not going to necessarily find at your dollar store, and that's really, really helping them, especially when it comes to growing an e-commerce business where people are looking for a one-stop shop for everything.
So before we let you,
I have a gluten-free friend. And it's a thing.
Good job.
It's a thing.
It is a thing.
I have multiple gluten-free friends.
I didn't know it was a thing.
Oh,
but
it's
now
a thing.
I've been educated.
You've been educated for that one friend.
Yes.
Before we let you go, we get a lot of retailers out this week as well. What are you going to be focusing on in the consumer trends land?
Definitely the holiday season. What are people seeing? That's the big question this year. Are people spending as much as they usually spend? Are they buying as many gifts as they usually buy? Also Thanksgiving for the grocers. I think a lot of people are just worn out from paying really high prices for food. They're also worn out from cooking a lot more than they have been since they're eating out less. So how is that showing up in consumer sales? Definitely trying to get a sense of how the consumer is feeling about what is the most significant shopping season of the year.
I know my husband's getting a little burnt by all the cooking he's doing. I'm really good at ordering takeout. He's the chef in the family. All right, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful to have you, Emily Cohn, joining us. She heads consumer trends coverage for Bloomberg News.
And welcome to Bloomberg.
Yeah, welcome. So you've been here a month?
Yeah.
Do you know how to send an email yet?
Barely.
I mean, I say that, but it took me like 6 months, so I mean that with all due respect. All right, coming up, Mandeep Singh, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Tech Industry Analyst, will be joining us on Google and the DOJ. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, happy Tuesday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business, economics, and finance through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence folks. They cover 2,000 companies in 130 industries worldwide. And here is one of the best of them, Mandeep Singh, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Tech Industry Analyst. He joins us now. A lot of things to pick about here. Obviously, NVIDIA tomorrow, definitely part of the story. But one is Google, and the DOJ pushing Google to sell Chrome to break up its search monopoly. How seriously do we need to take this, considering there's going to be like a new White House and a new DOJ in a few months?
Yeah, look, I think it's still uncertain who President-elect Trump is going to appoint to run the agency, and a lot depends on how hard they want to go against the likes of Alphabet and Meta. But in this case, the fact that DOJ is proposing, and we know the vice president-elect, he is not opposed to, breaking up these big tech companies. So clearly it is a risk. And I think when you look at what they're proposing, breaking Chrome, you could argue there are independent browser companies out there like Mozilla, so Chrome could exist as an independent company, but it's very hard to see how you can make a business model out of Chrome, and then it does hurt, Google's engagement. In the end, this is the distribution for Google, owning the Android operating system and owning the browser. You take out the browser, their distribution for search goes away. I mean, Google search will still be the dominant search engine, but in the internet world, it's about owning distribution. That's why Apple has so much cloud. That's why, owning Android and Chrome are the crown jewels when it comes to Alphabet as a franchise.
So Mandeep just painted us a pretty dire picture there. Guess what? Stock's up today. Why? Because people like Jen Rhee, who covers litigation for us, this is her sense. I know you didn't write this, because I know her writing. If Alphabet were forced by the DOJ to sell its Chrome browser, which we view as unlikely. So that's kind of the takeaway there. So when Jen Rhee tells me it's kind of unlikely, but still, I guess we have to expect, or I guess Google investors have to expect some types of modifications to their behavior in their business models. But I guess on the margin, the market's saying it's not going to be that material?
It's reflected in the stock. In the end, it comes down to what is the valuation right now, what is baked into the stock, and all the bad news around regulation is in the stock. That's why Alphabet is not trading at 30 times earning. It's trading at a discount to the likes of Microsoft. So, look, I think they will have to make remedies, even if it's not a forced divestiture. They're already starting to pare back when it comes to ad targeting, how much data they mix and match across their family of apps, whether it's YouTube, Maps, Search. So from that perspective, I think they are going to try and do these measures on their own. And, just to convince the regulators that owning the browser is not something that gives them an advantage. And maybe they have to expose the data that they are using for targeting the users when it comes to ads. That's the other part of the remedy here.
And this just means then they're getting ahead of it, right? Then they're getting ahead of anything that may come from DC or Europe at any time, in essence.
Yeah.
What are you going to be looking? Can I go to NVIDIA now? It's been 2 minutes. Okay, great. So tomorrow, NVIDIA. What am I looking at?
I mean, there's so many things when it comes to the continuation of this Gen AI wave. This is the bellwether company. And look, when it comes to data center spend, it's all about how scalable the models are going to be in terms of, whether it's ChatGPT or Google Gemini, how big of a cluster they want to create for next year. Because right now, everyone is looking at the compute that OpenAI has used for GPT-4, and they're saying they already have a trillion plus parameter model. Can it get any bigger? The answer from NVIDIA is yes. We are giving you a more powerful chip, and you can create a bigger cluster next year to train your models. So if that's the case, then the compute requirements continue to scale up, which is what they are betting on in terms of the data center upward revisions we have seen the whole of this year. And they think the scaling of the foundational models is going to continue. The moment you hear about a plateauing of the foundational models, that's when you know you're not going to see the upward revisions we have seen for NVIDIA's data center revenue.
NVIDIA stock is up 3% today, up 190% year to date with a $3.5 trillion market cap. Dan Ives from Wedbush Securities was out with a tweet this morning saying he believes that they will beat on revs by $2 billion and take their guidance up by another $2 billion. He calls that the drop of the mic.
But that may not be enough to drive the multiple. See, that's the thing.
It's 50 times forward earnings. You're right.
What is reflected in the stock? In the case of NVIDIA, last time around when they reported earnings, the stock had a 15% downward draft because everyone had such high expectations that even though they had a beat and raise, it wasn't enough.
That's a tough game to play, man.
Yeah.
But you came in here probably 6 quarters ago and said, as long as they keep doing it, the stock will keep working. But at some point, with that quarter's going to come where they're going to.
Yeah. Because it's not recurring revenue.
Yeah.
And in the end, the moment you're talking about digestion, okay, we have had enough in terms of scaling. Now we are focusing on inferencing and deploying this. We're not getting the bang for our buck when it comes to scaling the models. That's when NVIDIA has to find another way to, keep driving the growth.
All right, Mandeep, we appreciate you, and good to see you. Thank you so much, Mandeep Singh. No doubt we'll see him every day for the next few days. He's Senior Technology Analyst over at Bloomberg Intelligence. And we've got much more coming up as well. We're going to talk more about housing and Lowe's earnings with Drew Redding, Bloomberg Intelligence, U.S. home building analyst. I was building. I'm still building.
You're still building.
It's been a year since I wrote that first check.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yep, fun.
Good times. This is Bloomberg Intelligence. Happy Tuesday.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Tuesday. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We have a great hour lined up for you. We're going to take you back to Rio de Janeiro to Brazil with David Gura. He is there on the ground. Plus, Drew Redding, Bloomberg Intelligence U.S. home building analyst, will be joining us on Lowe's earnings. Plus, David Bahnsen, Chief Investment Officer over at the Bahnsen Group, breaking down his outlook for the markets. And Woo Jin Ho, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Technology Analyst on Supermicro. That stock flying the last couple days. Who would have thought that BDO would have been the accountant that they would have picked that would have been good for the equity market. Also, some breaking headlines here coming from the Wall Street Journal. President Trump apparently to pick Howard Lutnick as Commerce Secretary. Again, this coming from the Journal. We'll keep you updated on those headlines as they cross. In the meantime, let's give you a Bloomberg Business Flash with Charlie Pellet.
All right, thank you very much. Comeback, certainly the theme this morning. Right now, we have got the Dow, the S&P. They are both lower, but NASDAQ wiping out earlier losses. The NASDAQ Composite Index is advancing. And this Bloomberg Business Flash brought to you by Wells Fargo Advisors. Consider Wells Fargo Advisors Financial Network, where you can run your business with true independence, supported by unrivaled resources. Learn more at WFA.com/resources. Got to keep in mind that NASDAQ had been down 102 points, down 0.5% right now, though, looking at a gain of 61, up by 0.3%. And the S&P, which had been down 38, down by about 0.6%. Right now, we've got the S&P trading lower by 2 points, down less than 0.1%. So U.S. stocks are right now, the Dow, the S&P lower, a renewed bout of volatility gripping markets, traders wading through a flurry of geopolitical headlines. Right now, we have got the S&P, as I mentioned, down less than 0.1%, down 2 points. 10-year, 4.37%. The 2-year, 4.25%. Gold up $13 the ounce, $26.25, up 0.5%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.1%, $69.06 for a barrel of WTI crude. Next up for Wall Street, NVIDIA, a topic we were just talking about with our Mandeep Singh. Chris Watling is Chief Market Strategist at Longview Economics. And right here on Bloomberg Intelligence, he told us, yes, it's important, but not as key as it was for the market.
It's only one stock, and really the Mag 7 has become the sort of Mag 1 or 2. So there's a limit to how much the market can be powered high by a couple of stocks. And I think that's the point. And the other thing about NVIDIA is, the second derivatives of earnings growth is slowing. So it's kind of, when it's stocks like that, you need the first derivative to be fast. And that's now slowing. I wonder if margins are topping.
Chris Watling of Longview, of course. NVIDIA reports tomorrow after the bell. NVIDIA right now up by 3%. After earnings, Walmart boosting its outlook up by 4%. We've also got shares of Target, which reports tomorrow up 0.6%. Among the other names reporting this morning, home improvement retailer Lowe's down 3.5%. Rival Home Depot down now by 0.6%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney. We are live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming as well on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com, search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you'll find us. Red headline across the Bloomberg terminal, Trump to pick Howard Lutnick as Commerce Secretary. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, so we'll have further reporting on that as President-elect Trump continues to fill out his cabinet. As Charlie was just reporting, we've had a big turnaround in this market here since the early futures. We now have actually a little bit of some gains in the NASDAQ as well. Let's check in with Abigail Doolittle. She's our market coverage strategist here at Bloomberg. What are you seeing in the marketplace, Abigail? We had some concerns, I guess, geopolitical risk earlier in the morning, kind of turning that around a little bit.
Turning it around quite a bit. The S&P 500 right now down just fractionally. And the way that I often think about, or always really think about, headline risk versus real risk to the markets is whether or not it's going to affect the corporate profit outlook. So at the lows, the S&P 500 E-mini futures down 1.1%. So this is a significant turnaround. The fact that it was never panicked this morning, my first read of it this morning was the idea that folks do not think it's going to hit the corporate profit outlook. The other thing is, if we take a look at the defense contractors, for instance, right now I'm pulling up Lockheed Martin. The last time I looked, the stock up a little bit. It's up 0.4%. Raytheon, or RTX as it is now known as, up 0.5%. So those are not the robust gains of people being really fearful of some new part of this war being carried out. So that's one thing that I'm taking a look at in terms of today's market.
Yeah, and also, the move into treasuries, we had that sell-off yesterday, so in some respects, that also makes some sense. What other stocks are you looking at today?
Well, it's hard to not take a look at Super Microcomputer, this stock really all over the map. So yesterday, it had been up 16%. The day before that, up 3%. And of course, yesterday was the big day, and we were talking about this, Paul, and I think that you hit the nail on the head in terms of some people suspecting that they would actually get some sort of response to the NASDAQ that would be credible. Not only did they do that today, and the stock is now today up 32%, they also have a new auditor, BDO. So when I pull up the GPL version of the chart in the Bloomberg terminal off of the lows, this thing is gapping higher by literally 70% in 3 days. Now, there is a nearly 20% bearish short interest on this, so a lot of that's probably a squeeze. But stay tuned for this one. Let's see what they pull out of the hat. NVIDIA yesterday had been down on some fears around the Blackwell chip and also ahead of earnings tomorrow. Today, it's bouncing back a little bit, up 2.9%. In the retail space, what stands out is the difference between Walmart, which put up yet another good quarter, raised the outlook, and then Lowe's, which basically beat, but sales down just a little bit. So that stock being punished, plus the commentary that the housing market has slowed, rates, and people aren't buying big refrigerators and ovens and other big ticket items. So we continue to have this bifurcation in the economy that's showing up in the stock market.
I'd like to redo my bathrooms. Just can't find a dude. I mean, these people are working.
The contractors.
Oh, yeah. Contractors, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting piece of color for sure. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. Maybe it's just a short thing.
Well, I think Tucker might be free soon.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure I can afford John Tucker. Yeah, exactly.
Fair point. Okay.
All right, Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Abigail Doolittle, Chief Markets Correspondent for Bloomberg News here. Let's head down to Rio de Janeiro. We've been checking in all morning with David Gurr from Bloomberg News, and he's been down there at the G20 conference down there in Rio. David, thank you so much for joining us yet again. To what extent has the geopolitical news out of Ukraine and Russia overnight, David, how has that kind of been received in Rio?
Well, it's completely changed the official conversation here at the summit. We had that communique signed yesterday, so the official business of the summit, if you will, is mostly over. But folks here woke up to the news that those missiles had been launched from Ukraine into Russian territory, U.S.-made missiles, and that really sort of changed the conversation, really changed what we've been listening for from these world leaders as they've gone about their business here on this, the second day of the summit. So we've heard from a number of world leaders before bilateral meetings, and we heard from Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, this morning. He gave remarks that were mostly in the Russian language, but stopped at the end to speak in English to address what had happened overnight, to confirm that those missiles had been launched. We haven't gotten confirmation from the Ukrainians yet. But he said he saw that as an escalation by the U.S., a movement towards a wider war, and he had a warning for Western countries as well to read the nuclear doctrine that Russia has updated in the last few hours. That's effectively saying if a non-nuclear nation were to attack Russia with the help of a nuclear power, then Russia could retaliate in kind. So he sees that as a very sobering warning. While that remark was being made, President Biden was going about his business at the summit, attending a meeting on climate, didn't address Ukraine in specific. We have learned, Bloomberg News has learned in recent hours, however, that the NSC, the White House, doesn't plan to change its nuclear doctrine as a result of that. So we see the U.S. trying to calm things down here a little bit. But now I think the question going forward is, where do things go from here? There's been an effort on Ukraine's part to get Germany, for instance, to supply it with even more long-range missiles. Germany has been reluctant to do that, and we heard from the German Chancellor yesterday, him doubling down on that, him saying that Germany's not going to do that going forward. There's pressure on the United Kingdom as well. So we'll see sort of if this is an escalation, in fact, if we do see more of those weapons going to Ukraine at a time here on the 1,000th day of when this attack by Russia began on Ukraine, if we see a further escalation here in terms of force.
What do you expect the conversation the next few hours to continue to evolve, aside from what we're seeing with Ukraine and Russia?
What I'm listening for is any sort of more official remark from the United States about what happened here. Yes, about that attack, also about the nuclear doctrine. Again, what we've been able to piece together here has been through a source on the National Security Council who's offered that information, but we haven't gotten any kind of official statement. And we've talked a lot about the diminished role of President Biden here. It is customary that the President of the United States would give a press conference at the end of one of these summits. President Biden is not doing that here. I woke up this morning thinking maybe it would be an opportunity for him to come out and give a statement himself. That's not on the schedule so far here. So what I'm listening for is any indication of any kind of official response from the U.S. Again, I think that the effort here is to kind of ratchet things down, try to make things calmer globally. And the U.S. obviously could make strides in doing that. We'll see if that happens here on the ground in Rio.
David, to what extent is the President-elect Trump election victory and the Republican sweep in Congress, how is that being received in Rio?
Well, I think about it in the context of this particular issue. So we haven't gotten anything official in terms of a statement or a tweet or a Truth Social post from the incoming president. But I think that it has to be front of mind for a lot of these world leaders who are gaming this out and wondering where things go from here. So, look, we're at a point here that could be quite pivotal. It could mark an escalation. But there is this variable, Paul, that you're bringing up, which is in this new administration, what is the tack going to be? What is that approach toward Ukraine going to be? Is Donald Trump going to follow through on that promise to do all that he can do in the very early days of his presidency to end that war in Ukraine, or try to do so? And kind of look at that in complement with what we've heard from allies, what Bloomberg News has reported on, that being this kind of newer eagerness here to see this end with a negotiated settlement. Again, not knowing how that variable actually plays out here going forward is something that I think really complicates matters here for world leaders as they kind of calculate and calibrate their response to what's happened.
All right, David Gurr, thank you so much. We appreciate that. David Gurr, he's a correspondent for Bloomberg, and of course, he is the host of the Big Take podcast. He is down in Rio de Janeiro for the G20 summit. He's been there all week. We appreciate getting his reporting. Let's switch back to the stock market. Lowe's and earnings. They reported their earnings. A little bit of concern in the marketplace about maybe a slowdown in some of their core customers. The stock's off 3.6% year to date. But it's up about 18%. I'm sorry, it's off 3.4% today, but up about 18% year to date. Let's check in with Drew Redding. He's a homebuilder analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. He joins us in Princeton, New Jersey. Drew, what did you hear from the folks at Lowe's with their earnings release?
Yeah, not too dissimilar from what we heard last week from Home Depot. It was a beat and raise on same-store sales. That being said, there were some non-core items, as you mentioned. We know we had a prolonged period of warm, dry weather across the U.S., which provided a lift to some of their seasonal and outdoor categories. At the same time, they were beneficiaries of some of the hurricane activity we saw in the South. They called out 100 basis point impact to same-store sales. Home Depot called out 50 basis points. So some transitory items in there, but I think when you look at the core business, while it certainly appears that maybe things have stabilized, I think if you were looking for that inflection point, I don't think you got it yet. We continue to see consumers pressured by the cumulative impact of inflation, economic uncertainty, and housing activity, which is at the lowest level in over a decade.
So, Drew, do you expect then for 2025 consensus to start coming down to reflect that, or just pushed out?
Well, I think the recovery in housing has certainly been pushed out. I think expectations for home improvement as a whole are somewhat depressed. But what you have to keep in mind is, although housing activity is very low, Home Depot and Lowe's will start to lap those comparisons. So strictly from an optics perspective, things will become a little bit easier. So we do think you could start to see a little bit of growth maybe in the back half of next year off of a lower base.
Looking at the 30-year fixed mortgage, Drew, we're back up to 6.86%. That's kind of levels we haven't seen since kind of the summertime here. So somebody owns a home and they're thinking about moving. That really is not an incentive to move. That's a headwind there. What, as a housing analyst, how do you think about where mortgage rates need to go before people start moving around?
Yeah, you're right. It's a significant disincentive for current homeowners to trade in. They're sub 4% mortgage rate for something that's pretty much 7% right now. I think what we need to see is something in the low 6% range. When rates fell in September, to that low 6%, about 6.1, we did see a corresponding increase in activity. The builders that we've talked to have said somewhere around that 5.5% to 6% is kind of that magic number where they see demand start to come back into the market. We were there for a little bit, and it didn't take long, only a matter of weeks, until we were back above 7%. And we did see things cool off once again. So, I think we need to see not only rates come back into that 6% range, but they need to remain consistent for prolonged periods, so buyers out there can have some comfort that rates are gonna stay where they are.
So that's the macro backdrop. Operationally, how is Lowe's doing, say, compared to Home Depot? Or is it just going to be really moved by this macro story?
Well, the macro piece is certainly large, but they do have some company-specific things going on. And the two that I'd call out and that they point to are what they're doing in their pro business and what they're doing online. When you compare Home Depot and Lowe's, that's really the big differentiators. Home Depot has a lot more exposure to the professional contractor at 50% of sales. Lowe's only has about 25% exposure to that business, but it's over the last several years since Marvin Ellison came in and took over, it's really been a point of emphasis for the company. They didn't really have a strategy before. They didn't have proper inventory, staffing, the brands that pros needed. So they've made significant investments in that part of the business, not only in getting the product into the store and how they're serving their customers, but through supply chain investments and how they're actually getting that product to their contractors, whether it's on the job site, through online delivery or in-store pickup, things of that nature. At the same time, we're seeing improvement in their online business. Again, they were operating an antiquated platform, which really didn't allow consumers to go in and find the products they need. So they've made significant investments there, and we actually saw mid-single-digit growth in that business. So when you look longer term, certainly you need the macro to turn in order for these businesses to return to growth. But I think once that happens, they've made the investments in the appropriate place to capitalize on that turnaround.
All right, Drew Redding, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Drew Redding, home building analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. So when is your crib going to be done?
My husband has very high expectations that Thanksgiving will be spent there. I have lower expectations and things more like Christmas, but we see.
It was a major reno, though, right?
Basically like doubled the size of a super tiny house.
Okay.
And it was huge. It was definitely like a whole new renovation. This is a family house that my husband has in the Berkshires for 50 years that we had to sort of redo and build on, and it was something. Mm-hmm. It was definitely something.
now
So
everybody's
we'll see when we get there.
all right. Well, that's good. Hopefully that'll be good. Work out for you.
Yeah. Hopefully we won't get some super high construction costs coming in at the last minute.
Right.
Sure. Or labor costs. Well, we see. All right. Coming up, we're going to talk to David Bahnsen, Chief Investment Officer at the Bahnsen Group, get his outlook on the market as we keep getting these 2025 targets that keep coming up. The question really being like, what's the pain trade as we head into next year? And are we just borrowing some earnings from next year and that consensus a little bit too high? Plus, Woo Jin Ho, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Technology Analyst, will be joining us in the super micro latest, a humongous move in the last 2 days. We'll break down, is all of this enough to stem any sort of tide of selling? This is Bloomberg.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing, the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. Something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly.
We're Monzo. Give us a go. See?
I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need, like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
Hi, I'm Laurie Haynes, CEO and co-founder of Shirar, and I'm really excited to tell you that we are going to be raising funds for Shirar again. After a successful raise in 2023, it's time to scale.
We hope that you enjoy the pitch deck and the financial model. Any questions, please don't hesitate to ask us, and we can't wait for you to be part of Shirar.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Bloomberg, we have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average trading lower now, still down by 0.4%, down 158 points. S&P 500 index up 3. That is a gain of just about 0.1%. A NASDAQ also moving higher, up 73 now, up by about 0.4%. Stocks came off session lows in a volatile session marked by a flurry of geopolitical headlines. NVIDIA climbing in the run-up to its earnings tomorrow after the bell. Right now we have got the 10-year yielding 4.37%, the 2-year 4.25%. Gold up $16 the ounce, 26.28, up by 0.6%. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.3%, 68.93 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin right now up 1.1% at 92,405 on Bitcoin. Blackstone has agreed to buy a majority stake in sandwich chain Jersey Mike's as the alternative asset manager looks to further its investments in food services chains. Today, we are looking at shares of Blackstone up by 1.3%. Jersey Mike's, of course, closely held. Delta will begin serving Shake Shack burgers on longer flights out of Boston beginning December 1st. Plans to expand service to other U.S. markets throughout 2025. Delta right now up by 2%. Shake Shack shares, they're up now by about 1.4%. And President-elect Donald Trump will pick Howard Lutnick as Commerce Secretary, that according to the Wall Street Journal. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you'll find us. David Bahnsen joins us here. He's the Chief Investment Officer at Bahnsen Group. They have about $6.5 billion assets under management. David, thanks so much for joining us here. You woke up, 2 weeks ago almost. We have a new president in the White House starting January. We're going to have a new Congress as well. Did that change your outlook, your investment outlook at all?
It did not, in the sense that the primary things that drive markets we felt were not going to move a ton, which is around the earnings profile, earnings expectations, and the monetary policy. However, within the weeds, it reinforced our optimism in the energy sector, which has certainly been very validated over the last couple weeks, and the financial sector. That was an area where we thought policy would make a difference, and particularly some of President Trump's policies more favorable in those two sectors, and Vice President Harris is less so.
From the earnings perspective, you mentioned earnings obviously driving stocks here. We're just kind of finishing up with some of the retailers this week. What is your view of the earnings profile of this S&P 500 these days?
I think that the earnings profile is obviously very good, and that the growth of earnings next year is very good, and that is fully and completely priced in the market. And so the risk is really very little that earnings disappoint. I mean, that's always possible. There's always issues that could disrupt expectations. We happen to have a very, very good track record in our financial markets of being able to project earnings. However, you're paying 22, 23 times next year's best case earnings right now. And so I find that problematic.
So where else would you go then if that feels too expensive?
We would not buy the entire index, especially where it's cap weighted, especially where a lot of the big tech names that are big profit earners are trading at over 50 times. And if you're looking at trailing earnings, they're trading at 70 or 80 times earnings. Therefore, you have to be more selective, and we're more value biased at our firm and very dividend growth oriented. But some of the healthcare names, some of the financial names I mentioned, energy, right now, if everything goes perfectly for Mag 7, it's about 21% of next year's earnings. It's 33% of the S&P. Financials are the only two sectors. Earnings projections are more than what they represent within the S&P. So we just recommend people be more bottom up right now.
All right, so within, let's say, energy, for example, where in the energy space are you seeing opportunities?
very, very heavily in midstream. And that's kind of interesting to say because it's had a heck of a year. And really since November of 2020 has had quite a great tear, but it was doing so from just decimated prices out of COVID. Now, not only have the pricing environment and the psychology and investor sentiment got better, but the fundamentals are dramatically better. Way less debt, way less leverage, way more cash flow coverage, and certainly right now a policy you can see from the new Secretary of Energy coming in, the Secretary of Interior, there is a philosophical bend that is pro our ability to get permits for new oil and gas pipeline and to export LNG. These two things are huge growth sectors.
Yeah, meaning that you can actually put a shovel in the ground to build a pipeline, maybe.
That's right. And so what you have right now is a lot of value in the current pipelines because they're all we have. And then now you get the opportunity to build new pipelines, which I think adds to the growth profile of the sector.
So, Dave, how about in financials here? I mean, do you stick with the JP Morgan's, Goldman Sachs of the day, or do you try to get a little bit more specialized?
Well, so we own JP Morgan and have owned it since March of 2009, and it's one of the most profitable investments we've ever made. And we have had to tick down our weighting a little bit because it has just done so well, but we're not abandoning it. They're the cream of the crop, and there isn't another big bank we want to own. We also own, as far as big commercial banks, Morgan Stanley is the name we own, not Goldman Sachs. They're actually both fantastic companies, great brands, great franchises. It's just the dividend growth. We think Ted Pick, the new CEO at Morgan Stanley, I joke he's the person in America second most passionate about dividend growth, with myself being first. And we think Morgan Stanley's got a great fee-oriented business that's much less lumpy, much less dependent upon institutional securities and investment banking versus Goldman Sachs. Their wealth management and asset management are really annuitized at Morgan Stanley.
Hey, David, we really appreciate it. We always love your perspective on this. David Bahnsen, Chief Investment Officer at the Bahnsen Group. Thank you very much. One of the best performing stocks in the S&P today, yesterday, you name it, is Super Micro. Here with the latest is Woo Jin Ho, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Technology Analyst. So the latest is BDO. That's going to be their new auditor. That's not like a giant, huge name, though, right? Are you disappointed in the name, or is it just the fact that, hey, they have someone?
Yeah. Hey, Alex. Thanks for having me on. The fact that they actually got an auditor, given what they've gone through over the last 2-3 months, is actually positive news for them.
Wooj, when I kind of just look at this story, again, they've had some real concerns with their auditors and some of the auditors' concerns about the risk controls, I guess, at the company. Can you give us your opinion of management of this company and the board of this company?
Yeah. One of the reasons why E&Y resigned as an auditor as part of the 8K filing was that there were some integrity issues that they found as part of trying to get some financial documents. Paul, I haven't seen the word integrity issues in an 8K filing or an auditor resignation since back in the Enron days. I'm not saying that this is an Enron, but this is something that you don't typically find in filing. So, I have called for, you may need an overhaul of the board or greater independence and possibly change of the CFO because this is not the first rodeo of having delayed filings.
Do you feel like the stock move is justified, or does it have more to go? I mean, I'm taking a look at the move in the last couple of days, and it's tremendous, but if you look at a one-year chart, this move is a pittance.
Yeah, so if we think about the recent moves, there's actually been more headline risk that's been driving the stock than the fundamentals. I think much of this is more of a relief rally that they're not going to get delisted. Now, delisting would have meant a couple of things. First of all, they get delisted, and it is going to start some forced selling. But it also would potentially, it would have forced the removal of the S&P 500, which would have been another round of forced selling when the rebalancing comes in December the 5th. So that eliminates that risk for Supermicro, so there is some relief there. But they're still not out of the woods.
Where does this company fit into kind of your part of the tech stack, Wooj, in terms of being a supplier of, hardware and components and things like that? Because, I mean, it's got $25 billion of, I guess, revenue. I'm just looking at the FA function forecasted for June 25. I mean, it's a big company.
Yeah, look, it's all about AI. I'm in Atlanta today for an AI conference, and quite frankly, Supermicro is going to take a prominent role at this conference to get customers. The question I have is how reliable are those estimates? Keep in mind, there's been several coverage suspensions, and I don't know how up to date those estimates are.
Who are the customers for Supermicro?
Yeah, so we do know that there are a couple of large, there's one large cloud customer, which we suspect is Meta, but it's tier two cloud customers, company that may be filing for an IPO called CoreWeave, and also Tesla's XAI, they bought probably about $1.5 billion in equipment from Supermicro this past year.
And Wooch, to your point about the analyst coverage, I just pulled up the ANR function for analyst recommendations. Most or a lot of the analysts have suspended coverage or not rated is kind of what we see. So of the ones that do have a rating on there, 3 buys, 7 holds, and 2 sells. So it sounds like this company has a lot of ground ahead of it to rebuild confidence from the analyst community, probably their customers, and from investors. Is that kind of your thought?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think some of the headline risk has been eliminated for now, or at least extended. They only received an extension from the NASDAQ. The next milestone, quite frankly, is probably February 25th, when if they don't file their filings on time, by that time, the delisting questions will start arising again. They essentially kick the can down the road.
This might be a super silly question. At one point, I probably knew the answer to this. But where does Supermicro sit in the AI play stack?
Yeah, so they're actually in the server space. It's the hardware equipment that helps run the models. Among the U.S. vendors, they actually had the largest amount of AI server sales, larger than Dell and larger than HPE.
So they're very much like needed in this market. Like it's going to be hard to replace them either way, right? Like they're a needed essential.
Well, that's a good comment and good question. Competition has grown. Dell has actually strengthened their AI chops quite a bit. But I came back from a couple of conferences recently, and we're starting to see other companies with similar capabilities that will be making it much more competitive. And one of the evidence there so far is the lower gross margin. They peaked their gross margin at around 17% a couple of years back when they were the sole player. And now that you have more players coming in, their gross margin in the last couple of quarters went to about 13% and 11%.
Wow, I'm just looking at the DES function. March 19th of 2024, the company sold 2 million shares at $875 per share. Goldman Sachs, thank you very much. Woo Jin Ho, thank you for joining us. Woo Jin Ho is a senior technology analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. I mean, that is just amazing. They sold 2 million shares again in 2023 at $262. Stock is now $28. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with the developing story headline right off the Bloomberg Professional Service. FDIC Chairman Martin Gruenberg will be stepping down in January. That headline right now on the Bloomberg. We've got the Dow lower, the S&P, NASDAQ. They are both higher. S&P up 10 to 5903, a gain of 0.2%. The Dow, though, down 130, down 0.3%. NASDAQ up 103, up 0.5%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares.
I will show you how to get the best funding for your startup idea. Let's get started. Here's the deal. If you have an amazing startup idea and need funds to fuel it, we're here to help. Simply send us a video where you explain your idea. Make it clear, concise, and compelling. Hook us in with your passion and vision. Don't forget to include your contact details so investors can reach out directly. This is your chance to shine and get your idea in front of people who can make it a reality. Imagine turning your startup dream into a thriving business. It all starts with that one simple step. So what are you waiting for? Grab your phone, hit record, and let your idea fly. The future of your startup could be just one video away. Remember, be clear, be passionate, and most importantly, be you. We can't wait to see what you've got. Let's get funded now.
Talking about the new Trump administration and what that would look like, the Wall Street Journal reporting that Howard Lutnick may actually be a commerce secretary, which would be different maybe than reporting over the last few days. We also just heard the FDIC chairman, Martin Gruenberg, will be stepping down in January to retire. So let's get a little bit more on this with Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst. Nathan, what do you think of how a Trump cabinet and Trump official are shaping up right now?
Yeah, so I think with the appointments, what we've seen so far are really going to, I think, what President Trump's two main priorities in the first half of 2025 are going to be, and that's immigration and also tariffs/China, because what we're seeing both on the immigration side and also, just with commerce and a lot of the, the more economic picks that we've seen so far is that President Trump really does want to move forward with some of his campaign promises. For example, in the tariff scenario, he's talked about 60% goods, 60% tariff on all goods coming from China, for example. And, I think the selection of Mr. Lutnick to be Commerce Secretary sort of indicates that that's the plan that he wants to move forward with. But what we're saying is that, just remember, why do we care about these regulatory appointments? Also, not from just a, change of policy, but the more time the Congress spends confirming these appointments in the new year, meaning if there are confirmations, such as Attorney General Matt Gaetz, for example, that are going to take time, that's less time that Congress can focus on other matters, such as deregulation and tax reform.
Nathan, what is a recess appointment? Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, so the idea here is that if under the Constitution, if the Senate or the House are not in session, the president can come in and then make a recess appointment. Now, if this happens, essentially that individual can only serve through the next congressional term, so that person can only serve 2 years. Now, the Senate does what are called pro forma sessions. They come in every 3 days. It's usually a senator from Virginia, Maryland. They gavel the Senate open. They wait 3 minutes to close it to prevent the president from doing that. Now, what would happen in this case is the Senate would have to adjourn for 10 days for the president to put in a recess appointment. The Senate historically does not like doing that because then you're giving power to the presidency. The most likely scenario is that if President Trump, for example, can't get Attorney General, designee Matt Gaetz through, then he's going to go to the House of Representatives to ask the House to adjourn, because if one chamber adjourns and the other one does not agree, the president would have the authority to adjourn Congress and then therefore put in the recess appointment. I would note, however, is that Congress, from the historical perspective, would not want to do this because Congress, just remember, is one separate but equal branch of the U.S. government, and they do not like it when the president moves forward and actually does their own recess appointments without their input.
Yeah, but is this time different? I mean, it's President Trump. It's a different situation. When do you think we're going to get a Treasury Secretary, and do you think that it matters in that whomever is picked will sort of be the same kind of presence in the Treasury Secretary seat?
So I think we're going to get the Treasury Secretary pick fairly soon. The question is, are we going to get a Wall Street pick or are we going to get a populist pick? What I will say in terms of, tariffs and going back to President Trump's main, one of his main priorities, the Treasury Secretary isn't as important when it comes to the implementation of tariffs. That's really Commerce and other agencies. But, the Treasury Secretary is going to be this Wall Street-facing individual, and President Trump likes it when stocks go up into the green, for example. So I think President Trump is weighing the differences at the moment. Obviously, Howard Lutnick was reported to be part of that. Scott Bessent, Mark Rowan, for example, from Apollo. But I think we're going to get this choice fairly soon, and then we'll get the other economic choices with it, NEC chair, then SEC, FDIC, and so forth like that.
Is there a belief in D.C. that some of these more controversial selections that may be more populist, like a Matt Gaetz, for example, like a Tulsi Gabbard, that in fact Congress may push back on this, the Senate may push back on approving the nomination?
Yeah, so I think the Senate behind the scenes, and remember, this is just Republicans. The Democrats are almost irrelevant at this point because you can confirm these nominees by a 50-plus. Republicans will have 53 in the Senate. We've heard behind the scenes, Bloomberg News has done some great reporting here, that the Senate, several Senator Republicans are pushing back specifically on Matt Gaetz. We've also heard that President Trump is pushing back and is essentially having a little standoff of sorts. Now, how did it get resolved? I'm not exactly sure. Whether President Trump does a recess appointment, notice I said the word historically many times. Things could be different here. But what I will say is that the more time the Senate is spent fighting these or confirming these or working on these nominees, less time is spent on things like tax reform because the Republicans have the House and the Senate. They want to move forward quickly next year to do tax reform via the reconciliation process. And the more time they spend on nominees, the less time they're going to spend on tax reform.
So you mentioned the Commerce Department really being key then for tariffs. The Wall Street Journal reporting that Howard Lutnick could become Commerce Secretary. What do you think about that pick?
Yeah, so I think this is where the soap opera version of maybe the Trump 1.0 administration comes in, because I'm sure that Mr. Lutnick is going to have more of a Wall Street-facing view of the idea here that tariffs may not be the best thing for the U.S. economy. That is in conjunction or in opposition to several of the other picks that President Trump has made. But I think this is somewhat indicative of what President Trump wants in his cabinet, his different voices. But at the end of the day, remember, this is President Trump's decision alone. He can order the Commerce Secretary or the Homeland Security Secretary or anybody to do something because they serve at the pleasure of the president. So I would say that, obviously the new, Howard Lutnick coming in as Commerce Secretary can certainly advise the president and certainly give him, I think, what the Wall Street view is, but ultimately it's President Trump's decision whether to move forward or not.
Nathan, timing. When do the Senate confirmations, when do they happen?
So they would start happening. Obviously, Senate comes in January 3rd. The president comes in January 20th. It would start immediately thereafter. The Democrats can slow the process a little bit. They can't stop it, but they can certainly slow it. And so if these picks move forward and they're not really controversial, they can be in by January, February, and early March. If it gets to be a little bit more controversial, I think that's where things go on and the soap opera really goes into earnest. And also I would just say on the funding fight that we're going to see in December, he wants to kick the funding issue to March. We could have a government shutdown in March, all the meanwhile that this is happening.
Shh, don't say that. What are you doing to us, Nathan? Okay, let's play it out a little bit. Potentially Kevin Warsh becoming Treasury Secretary, Steve Bessent becoming the National Economic Council. Is this a Wall Street kind of situation then for you?
Yeah, so I think honestly that what it sounds like and what it sounds like it's coming together is you'll have Commerce and Treasury be a little bit more Wall Street friendly than you would, some of the other agencies that President Trump seems to have gone with a populist tone. And I think this is going to President Trump's desire again of immigration reform, Chinese tariffs, but also having a Wall Street and an economy that works. And so I think President Trump is picking different voices from different aspects of what he wants to see. But then, they're going to fight it out. They're going to have these policies. They're going to have the, Bloomberg News is going to be doing some great reporting on what's happening behind the scenes. But then ultimately it will be President Trump's decision to move forward with tariffs or any of these immigration policies and say move forward and get it done.
All right, thanks so much. Super appreciate Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst, joining us on Trump Cabinet Pick. That's a great way of looking at it, sort of Wall Street versus a populist pick at the end of the day. All right, coming up, we are going to talk about Paul's favorite subject, aside from media, and that's real estate. This is the story he sends out. yesterday afternoon. He's like, I was waiting for this to happen. Brookfield's Bank of America Tower sees a 69% decline in its appraised value. That is whopping. We're finally starting to see these cracks here. We will break that down in the next segment. Equity is recovering from their lows of the session.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well. So head over to youtube.com, search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you'll find us. All right, I saw this Bloomberg News article yesterday. I said, yes, this is the story I've been waiting for, because when you think about the office real estate business, it's just brutal how things have changed there in terms of back to work and hybrid working, and the companies just don't need as much real estate. So you're seeing some real vacancy issues, and you really wanted to get a sense of where is the market. Brookfield's B of A Tower, this is in LA. It traded hands at a 69% decline in appraised value. 69%. It's just extraordinary. And this is a trophy building in downtown LA. I was in it a million times during my career because Capital Research Group is based there, and they're one of the biggest clients out there for Global Wall Street. Catherine Chiglinski joins us, real estate team leader for Bloomberg News, joins us here in our studio. Kat, that's a real building in a real city, and it gets marked down dramatically. Wow.
Pretty dramatically, yeah. And I think we're, a lot of these buildings, these office buildings in particular, there's sort of this reckoning happening, and it takes a while. Commercial real estate doesn't always move so fast, and I think there is sort of a sense that maybe if rates are stabilizing and we sort of know what is the peak, at least to some extent, people might be able to have a better, firmer grasp of what are these buildings actually worth.
So is the issue going to be so building specific, or were they like overvalued in the past and then that's coming home to roost?
a healthy mix of both, right? I think a lot of it is sort of the financing and the fact that, yeah, some people bought apartment buildings and office buildings at sort of peak valuations, and now those have come down and you have to reconcile. Therefore, I think, you know, for some investors coming in, if you can buy these things for much cheaper, it honestly might be a better deal because your cost basis is so much lower. Then again, I do think it is pretty building specific. I mean, we were just talking about downtown LA has faced this big reckoning, right? It's not nearly so easy to get employees into there, but you take other neighborhoods like Century City doing much better with offices.
That Century City is where the Bloomberg's new office is, by the way. Spectacular office out there in Century City, overlooking Bel Air Country Club. The office availability rate in downtown LA, which is among the hardest hit areas, was about 38% in the third quarter. So that's kind of, that's pretty rough. And the numbers on this one, the Bank of America Plaza, this is a 55-floor tower. Was appraised at $188.9 million, down from $605 million 10 years ago. So those are some big numbers. When you talk to the real estate folks out there, are they saying this is kind of the bottom, we're setting the bottom, or maybe we don't know where the bottom is? I don't know.
I think, you know, if you had asked me this at the beginning of September or something, I think people would have been like, great, we finally reached the bottom, you're seeing rates come down, things are starting to ease. I think there's been a little bit of a change in recent weeks as Treasury yields have backed up a little bit. And, you know, while I do think people are still pretty sure that we likely have reached the bottom, I think there's maybe a little more uncertainty into the mix. And you look at now Treasury yields up after the election and some questions there too.
Well, good, yeah.
It's interesting. This is Brookfield Properties. This is a major, you know, real estate company. They own stuff all over the world. The B of A Plaza is one of 7 properties. Brookfield has a portfolio of LA properties, so it's called DTLA portfolio, downtown LA. They have 7 properties in that portfolio, and they've defaulted, all but one of which have defaulted on a total of $2.2 billion in debt. And that includes the gas company tower, another famous tower downtown, once valued at $630 million, which the County of Los Angeles has agreed to purchase for $200 million.
Well, oh my God.
Yes, exactly.
I was going to say, so like, what happens now? So clearly, in some aspects, it can be sold at super cheap. Do they refi? Like, how does this work now?
Yeah, I think if these buildings are finding sellers, it's often for, we call them owner-occupied buildings. So it's like, yeah, the city of LA that's actually going to put employees in that building. It's universities who know that they're going to use it for a research lab. I think that's a lot of the buyers we're seeing. But we have been seeing some bottom feeders, and you know, it wouldn't shock me if, like, particularly in New York, you start to see more people.
It's a reasonable rally. I mean, how much more upside is there to it?
So it's funny, about 4 years ago, I wrote a piece on why Bitcoin can reach 100,000. And I think in 2025, there may be a chance that we actually see that prediction coming across. But putting that aside, I do think that Bitcoin's value has always been holding true. The reason that we are seeing it going up is exactly a reflection of markets' reaction to Trump administration, or the anticipation of Trump administration being pro crypto, pro Bitcoin, and also pro economy.
Huge things are coming. What exactly are we looking out for? What would be a game changer in terms of regulation, easing of regulation? What would prompt that rally to go higher?
I think there are actually two sides. One is really market expectation about how the Trump administration's policy will affect the macro economy in general. You know, general policies around tax cutting, general policies around healthcare spending, around their external policy, and the impact on labor market. That's one side. I think generally right now, at least, the market is very optimistic about what the new administration will do and how it will actually help support the market. I think the other side is about what the market expecting about the administration's policy toward crypto, right? In general, like clearer policy, clearer regulation, whether there will be actually a federal regulator instead of, in current state, it's very much state-by-state approach. Is SEC or CFTC going to take the realm? How long will the industry see actually certainty? And that actually have a huge impact on how the banking industry, particularly the tier 1 banks, their appetite in accepting crypto business and providing on-ramp to crypto platforms, which obviously have a downstream impact on crypto price in general.
You is next after this global news update. Happy Tuesday. We will see you tomorrow. Equities on the upside. This is Bloomberg.
This is CBS News on the Hour, sponsored by Progressive Insurance.
I'm Steve Kathan. CBS News has learned an unknown and unauthorized third party has gained access to 24 depositions of witnesses tied to investigations into Matt Gaetz, the Trump pick for Attorney General. CBS's Scott McFarland says it comes amid an unreleased House ethics report.
Democrats in that panel have been saying unequivocally they think this should be in the hands of U.S. senators. That senators should review what they have on Matt Gaetz before deciding whether or not to confirm him as the nation's top law enforcement officer. Talking to U.S. senators today, it's become clear they seem to be already frustrated and fatigued with the questions.
The White House blasts new nuclear rhetoric from Russia on a day when Ukraine has put American long-range missiles to use.
1,000 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, 2 days after President Biden granted Ukraine's wish to fire U.S.-supplied long-range missiles into Russia, President Vladimir Putin has lowered the nuclear threshold, saying Russia could be prepared to pull the nuclear trigger in response to an act of conventional warfare that's supported by a nuclear power. The White House has just slammed what it calls Russia's irresponsible rhetoric. CBS News can confirm that Ukraine has now fired U.S.-made Attacker missiles into Russia. Vicki Barker, CBS News, London.
FEMA Chief Deanne Criswell tells Congress there's an investigation into allegations that hurricane assistance was denied to some Trump supporters.
I do not believe that this employee's actions are indicative of any widespread cultural problems at FEMA. FEMA, however, has taken appropriate action to ensure that this matter is fully investigated, and I am committed to ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again.
Flash flooding is expected in parts of the Pacific Northwest as a major storm system gathers steam. CBS Philadelphia meteorologist Grant Gilmore.
You've got an incredibly powerful bomb cyclone, which is essentially a strengthening low-pressure system that's going to feed in one of the strongest atmospheric rivers of the season so far. While some places could see nearly 20 inches of rain.
Some higher elevations in the west could see heavy snow. Bloomberg reports the Justice Department plans to ask a judge to force Google's parent company to sell Chrome, the internet browser, follows a landmark ruling that found the company created an illegal monopoly on search engines. CBS Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady.
Owning the #1 browser provides critical user data for its advertising. Further, as artificial intelligence becomes more integrated into search, any restrictions could prevent Google's chance of being a market leader.
And checking Wall Street, the Dow is down 130. The S&P and NASDAQ are higher. This is CBS News.
Of the returning first stage booster. It'll be tough to top the last test, which saw a successful launch, and then the capture of the returning first stage booster to the launch pad caught in midair. SpaceX says it hopes the 6th test flight will include repeating that feat, along with reigniting Starship's Raptor engine while in space, testing its heat shield and maneuvering capability during re-entry. Splashdown will be in the Indian Ocean. SpaceX hopes to use the Starship for NASA's planned moon landings and Elon Musk's plan to go to Mars. Peter King, CBS News.
The White House Christmas tree is set to be cut down and transported from a North Carolina farm tomorrow. It's from a place that lost thousands of trees in a county that was hardest hit by the destructive wallop of Hurricane Helene. I'm Steve Kathan, CBS News.
Okay, I have to tell you, I was just looking on eBay where I go for all kinds of things I love, and there it was.
That hologram trading card. One of the rarest. The last one I need.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Moscow warns the U.S. is provoking open war with Russia. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the war in Ukraine escalates on its 1,000th day. After Ukraine fires U.S.-made ATACMS missiles across the border, we're going to have reaction from the G20 underway right now in Rio with a live report from Bloomberg's David Gura. Donald Trump fills in another blank. Commerce Secretary, this time reportedly Howard Lutnick, goes to Commerce. We'll discuss the transition with Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischman of Tennessee and with our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano is with us, along with Republican strategist Lisa Cabuso-Miller. Let's get to Wall Street first. As always, we set the baseline with Charlie Pellet at World Headquarters in New York. Charlie?
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Good day from New York. We have got the S&P 500 index moving higher after earlier declines. Right now, the S&P little changed, but up 5 points, up just under 0.1%. Dow Industrials down 157, a decline right now of 0.4%, while NASDAQ is up 77 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, an advance right now of just about 0.4%. 10-year 4.37%, the 2-year 4.25%, gold up $15 the ounce, 26.27 up 0.6%, and West Texas Intermediate crude oil trading lower, down 0.1%, 69.11 on WTI. Bitcoin continues to move higher, up 1.5% right now, 92,707 on Bitcoin. As for the overall market backdrop and what has been driving sentiment, Stephanie Roth is chief economist at Wolfe Research. She was a guest this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
It's all about the election, and it's all about the market. Certainly, the market trades Trump as a yield curve steepener. We've seen that to some extent. There are concerns about the deficit. I don't think that's the primary driver. I think it's the market's getting excited about a better growth outlook. And for 2025, I think that's fair. For 2026, I'm worried about the tariff impact on the economy.
Stephanie Roth of Wolfe Research, and you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. After earnings, Walmart shares are advancing, up 3.5% right now. Target reports tomorrow, up 0.9%. Home improvement retailer Lowe's down 3.9% after earnings this morning. Rival Home Depot down by 0.4%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet in New York. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, and here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. The voice of the markets and, incidentally, the New York subway. Charlie Pellet will have more on the markets a little bit later on this hour. We're going to keep close tabs on Wall Street today because everything we're talking about in the world of politics is bearing out on Wall Street, in the bond market, the stock market. What's happening today in Ukraine, and more specifically in Russia, is very important. When you consider the impact of the transition, the names that we're hearing from Donald Trump's camp coming into the new administration, investors are listening very closely to each headline. With the VIX rising this morning on news from Ukraine, we'll walk through this together. Carrying out the first strike with the ATACMS missiles that we talked about here just yesterday. Remembering that Joe Biden finally unleashed the ATACMS, if you will, so Ukraine can in fact use them offensively against Russia. Western-supplied missiles used to strike a military facility in Russia, the first known attack of its kind. Reports say they fired 6 of them. Fast forward to the response from the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, in Russia. The ATACMS use inside Russia, he says, is a signal of escalation. Now, we heard from both of them just in the past couple of hours, addressing the European Parliament, President Zelensky earlier today. Let's listen.
We must push Russia toward just peace. Every blow and every threat from Russia must be met with firm sanctions. For 1,000 days, it has been crucial to radically reduce Russia's ability to fund its war through oil sales.
Now, of course, we heard quickly from Russia on this. Sergei Lavrov holding a news conference in Brazil. He is, in fact, there as opposed to Vladimir Putin, and says that he hopes the West will study Russia's new nuclear doctrine that we're going to talk about in a moment with David Gura from his news conference earlier. Here's Sergei Lavrov.
Ну, вы знаете, в принципе, если люди знакомы, если между ними, между странами, которые эти люди представляют, глубокие противоречия, но где-то эти люди сталкиваются в публичном месте, но я считаю, это абсолютно нормально, если они знакомы, поздороваться друг с другом. Я считаю, ненормально, когда вот европейские многие лидеры шарахаются от российских представителей.
All right, so obviously not speaking English in this case. What he said was, quote, "We'll be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we will act accordingly." Now, this is where we begin our conversation today with David Gura, who is still in Rio de Janeiro as the G20 wraps the summit here. President Biden will be heading home today, but this is the location where world leaders are talking about this right now. Bloomberg News correspondent, the host of the Big Take podcast in Rio. David Gura, what is the conversation on the ground there today as this story unfolds?
Well, Joe, I'm glad you played that clip of Sergei Lavrov, and you talked earlier about how markets have been moving on this news. In fact, they did as he spoke, and in those comments, sort of reiterating the fact they viewed this as an act of aggression, and pointed to that nuclear doctrine you mentioned just a moment ago. Let me talk a bit about that. Russia updated that nuclear doctrine to say if Russia were to be attacked by a non-nuclear nation, a nation without nuclear weapons, but did so in concert with a nuclear power, it would see that as an act of aggression it could respond to in kind. So that obviously worrisome, obviously a sign of escalation, at least rhetorically. Now, there was a split-screen moment when that happened. As Sergei Lavrov was speaking, Joe Biden was attending a formal debate here at the G20 summit talking about climate. So he didn't address what happened overnight in those remarks. A little bit later, our colleagues at Bloomberg News spoke with someone on the National Security Council who said, look, the U.S. is not going to respond in kind. It's not going to change its nuclear doctrine as a result. This was something that, in effect, the U.S. expected would happen. It's kind of been months in the making that they were going to update that document and those principles. But clearly from the U.S. here, there is an effort to sort of calm things down a little bit just because of the seriousness of this. And I should say, just lastly on this point, it really has scuttled the agenda here once again at the G20. I mentioned Joe Biden was talking about climate. We had some agreements on hunger and other policy points. This is now something that everyone's talking about and has been indeed at all of these bilateral meetings that have been taking place on this, the last day of the summit, as world leaders are getting their final opportunities to talk to one another and to deliver statements to the press.
The sideline conversations must be something, and it kind of reminds me of this idea of not responding as a response to the doctrine of the movie War Games, right? You can only win if you don't play. David Gura, what is the conversation that Joe Biden is having with his European allies and what will likely be his last opportunity to sit down with them in a forum like this?
I think he's likely making the point that he's made leading up to this summit, that it's his mission before he leaves office to make sure Ukraine has what it needs to continue fighting this war, fight it as best it can. Obviously, the conversation is now widening now, and we're hearing President Zelensky say to the Germans, for instance, give us those Taurus missiles that could give us more of an opportunity to strike Russia on its own soil, looking to the United Kingdom as well. You know, it's interesting. Yesterday, we were talking about a conversation that German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had with Vladimir Putin a few days ago. He has been asked over and over again by world leaders just about the substance of that call. And indeed, it came up this morning when he had a much-watched bilateral meeting with President Xi of China. So he, in fact, is sort of carrying the most information that these allies have about a possible path forward here. We know that there is a movement coalescing among allies to sort of move toward a negotiated settlement. It is through that extraordinary call that the German Chancellor had with the Russian president that we have the most information about what that might look like, what might bring Vladimir Putin to the bargaining table, perhaps with the Ukrainian president as well. I don't want to suggest that that's in any sort of near term, but he has the most information sort of what a diplomatic solution here could look like as we begin to see the contours of that.
Is there going to be an argument over a communique? Will it mention what happened with Russia and Ukraine this week?
In fact, we have that communique, and it's so interesting because this was a real hot-button issue, a real flashpoint for all of the nations here. This was something that President Lula of Brazil wanted to have happen. You'll remember, Joe, we've had these summits before where there hasn't been a joint declaration, there hasn't been a communique. Right. President Lula really wanted there to be one. So yesterday, as they were debating the content of that document, there were some efforts by some nations here to have more specific language about the war in the Middle East, have more specific language about the conflict in Ukraine. Lula quickly put an end to that. He effectively gavelled that conversation closed just because he didn't want this to kind of open up a can of worms where there'd be a lot of squabbling over one word here, another word there, and might lead to not having a declaration. So we have that communique. The language about these conflicts is very broad, dare I say anodyne, and focuses much more on, once again, were these formal agenda points that are kind of largely unrelated to what we're all talking about today, which is where this war, where this wider conflict might be headed.
We asked you about the family photo yesterday, not to dwell on this, David. It's one of the moments that we all remember from summits like these, and Joe Biden wasn't present for it yesterday. I don't know how you miss the outgoing president of the United States in a snapshot like that, but apparently there is going to be a second take. What's planned?
There was a lot of speculation about why that happened. Was he delayed? Was this something where President Biden didn't want to appear with Sergei Lavrov on stage? What the White House is saying is there was just a miscommunication about timing, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni were also not present for that first photo. In the end, President Lula said it would not be fair to Joe Biden here at his last G20 summit to leave without that memento, without that photograph of him with these other world leaders. So lunch has just wrapped up at the summit. They were able to take one more version of that photograph, and Joe Biden will be making his way back to Washington, as you said, later today, Joe, with that photograph in hand.
Fascinating. I'll tell you, the enduring image for me will be David Gura with this beautiful backdrop in Rio de Janeiro. David, will catch up with you a little bit later on today. Thank you again for your reporting. Final day of the G20 here in Rio, and a pretty nice assignment for David. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is important stuff. Don't be transfixed by the beach. The conversations that are happening in Rio will now come back home to Washington as we prepare for Donald Trump to take office. This is Joe Biden's final G20, as we told you yesterday, and it's one that happens to coincide with some pretty important news. Hold the bead on what we talked about in Ukraine and Russia. We'll be joined ahead by a Republican congressman from Tennessee who is co-chair of the Nuclear Security Working Group. That's Chuck Fleischman. The Republican will talk to us about what's happening overseas, as well as Donald Trump's pick for energy secretary, and of course the funding battle that's about to get underway here in Washington, D.C. Remembering the government runs out of money December 20. We'll be counting down together on the fastest show in politics. Stay with us. A lot more ahead from Washington. This is Bloomberg.
5:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A down day for the Dow Jones Industrial Average, an up day for both the S&P 500 Index and the NASDAQ Composite Index. Right to the numbers, here's where we stand. S&P up 4, gain there of just about 0.1%. Has been a volatile session with the S&P now standing at 58.97. The Dow down 161, decline there of 0.4%, while NASDAQ higher by 77, a gain of 0.4%. Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares up now by about 0.2%. The 10-year 4.36%, the 2-year 4.25%. Gold up $19 the ounce, 26.31, up 0.7%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.1%, 69.24 a barrel. Bitcoin up now by 1.3%, 92,500 on Bitcoin. Super microcomputer shares are surging by 33% after the company hired a new auditor and filed a plan to come into compliance with NASDAQ listing requirements. Just getting word that the New York Jets have fired GM Joe Douglas, that according to ESPN. Recapping, S&P little changed, up now by 1 point. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, and here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Of course, Charlie was watching the markets swoon a bit earlier as we heard from Sergei Lavrov in Russia, the Russian response to Ukraine's use of U.S.-provided ATACMS missiles across the border, striking offensively against Russia, which prompted a reaction from Vladimir Putin, lowering the threshold for a nuclear strike in response to a broader range of conventional attacks. Now, the U.S. response right now is no response. As I mentioned earlier, it recalls the movie War Games. The only way to win is not to play. But it's pretty hard to not play when things are unfolding before your eyes like this, and that's where we want to start our conversation with Chuck Fleischman, the Republican congressman from Tennessee's 3rd District, is with us live from Capitol Hill right now. Congressman, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. I'm supposed to ask you about this funding deadline, and we'll get to that. I have a lot of questions about the lame duck, but you have an important viewpoint on this story as co-chair of the Nuclear Security Working Group, and from your position with your specialty in energy, I know you're focused on this closely. How important, how dangerous is this development today that you're seeing coming out of Russia with a new nuclear doctrine?
This is very dangerous. The rhetoric from Vladimir Putin over the past several months, including today, has been very dangerous in terms of threatening the use of a nuclear weapon. This should be condemned universally across the world because we cannot have that kind of talk coming from any of the nuclear leaders in the world. Russia has a nuclear arsenal. I can assure you the United States has the best, strongest nuclear arsenal. I fund it through the Department of Energy, the NNSA. We are well prepared, but we want to make sure that we lower the temperature and have a strong statement that there can never be the use of a nuclear weapon, even a tactical nuclear weapon, a smaller one, on the battlefield. It would escalate beyond what we could just even fathom. It's ridiculous. It's wrong. It must be condemned.
What do you make of the response, the non-response, if you will, from the U.S. congressman? And how worried are you that Vladimir Putin will try to take advantage of the remainder of the Biden administration to do some damage here before Donald Trump is in office?
Well, I can't wait for January 20th to get here. This is why I believe that President Trump will get in, sit down with Zelensky and with Putin and bring this horrific situation, this sad chapter in world history to a close. But the reality is we've got to be very careful day to day. We do not want this to escalate, to spread, and God forbid, we do not want to see the use of a nuclear weapon on the battlefield or anywhere else. That's why we have a strong nuclear deterrent in our country. That's why we have built that up. But for Putin to engage in this type of rhetoric is wrong. He needs to pull it back.
Well, do you think this strengthens, the use of the ATACMS strengthens President Zelensky's hand if he is about to approach the negotiating table with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, assuming that happens? Because when we look at the map of territory that's been occupied by Russia, That seems to be a lot to ask for the Ukrainians. In fact, they say they won't entertain handing that land over, whether it's the Donbass or Crimea. What do you think?
Well, there's absolutely no question that on the ground, if you look at the Ukrainian map, that the Russians have made tremendous gains across the country. There's been a tremendous cost to them. Their casualties are high. They've gotten even higher. This has not been an easy war for Putin. His losses are horrific. So he's probably looking for an exit strategy. I will say this. Ukraine has lost a lot of land. There's probably going to have to be some type of a compromise. I think the only person with credibility to get both parties to the table is Donald Trump. The rest of the world has basically been engaged in a very sad spectator sport. Trump will probably put this to an end quickly, but I don't know what that compromise looks like, but we have got to stop the carnage.
Well, Congressman, you're back in Washington with your colleagues here with the to-do list in the lame duck session, and I would love to get into some of the asks, beginning with funding the government. You know, everyone's going to start running their countdown clocks. Tomorrow is 1 month out from December 20 and the lapse of funding. There is a debate right now about whether you should clear the decks for Donald Trump by kicking the can well into next year. Some say March, some say September. Others say no, Donald Trump should have a hand in writing the next budget that comes to the nation. What do you think?
Well, I think we need to hear from President Trump on this. I'm very solicitous of his thoughts. The fiscal year began for our country October 1st. We have a continuing resolution, as you alluded to December 20th. By that time, we either have to have a budget in place and a deal or go into next year. It'd be my vote to basically get it done this year. President Trump's going to have a lot on his plate with budget reconciliation, with taxes, and other issues that the nation, the border, has to be addressed. We don't want to necessarily have this appropriation situation on his plate unless he wants it on his plate. So the reality is, the sooner we get a budget done, the better. Clean it up and let President Trump go into a new, clean administration, a new year. However, if President Trump feels differently, we'll be glad to entertain that.
Okay. So if it were up to you, would you prefer March or September? And would that continuing resolution include the millions of dollars, the hundreds of millions that the Biden administration asked for to clean up from the hurricanes that partially impacted your state?
Well, certainly we need disaster relief. I don't know what that package looks like. President Biden put forth a letter today to the Speaker of the House in that regard. Ultimately, I think we need some type of a disaster relief, but that would be in terms of a supplemental addition to the budget. My preference would be get a deal done on the overall appropriations package by December 20th. There's some problems with that practically, though. The House and Senate are $100 billion apart. The Senate is much higher. I don't know whether or not Senator Schumer would deal. He'd be a fool not to deal, given what we're going to see with Republicans in charge of the House, Senate, and White House next year. But once again, I think the sooner we get a budget for our country, the better. I would have preferred to see a budget September 30th going into October 1st. We didn't get that. So I would take December 20th. But if not, we'll go into March.
That's the view from a member of the Appropriations Committee, we should note. With your interest in energy, Congressman, and your position in Congress, I would love to hear from you on Donald Trump's pick for the Energy Department. Everyone is obsessing over a lot of other picks, but not so much Chris Wright. He's the CEO of Liberty Energy, said to be an innovator when it comes to fracking, and someone who will look to undo the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the incentives that came along with it. Is he the right pick for the job?
Well, I applaud President-elect Trump for this choice. I don't know Mr. Wright. We have reached out. Hopefully I'll be able to speak with him, because my subcommittee, the Energy and Water Subcommittee, will fund the Department of Energy, which includes the NNSA, which has the nuclear arsenal, but also all of the energy endeavors. So I do look forward to meeting and visiting with Mr. Wright, as well as Governor Burgum, who's going to chair the Energy Council. He's going to have Interior, but he's also going to have this special new executive branch Energy Council. ultimately, I'll be responsible for funding or not funding those endeavors. But a good choice, looks like an oil and gas person. He's got good competence. He's got good business experience. I was also pleased to see that he tends to be pro-nuclear. That's my space in Congress. I'm the most pro-nuclear power congressperson in Congress. I'm looking for somebody with whom I can continue that great work that has been bipartisan, bicameral, and has gone through several administrations to promote American nuclear.
I've been seeing a video that Mr. Wright said there is no climate crisis, and we are not in the midst of an energy transition either. It's a quote that has been repeatedly used over the past couple of days since Donald Trump mentioned his name. I won't try to relitigate the climate element with you here, but when we talk about energy transition, he's presumably talking about green. Will he, in fact, bring an energy transition back to nuclear? Congressman, you just brought this up, and we know that the great need for clean and renewable energy here, and in this case, uninterruptible energy from a nuclear source for the data centers that are popping up like weeds all over the country, will have to be addressed in this next administration. What would the new energy secretary do, and what would you do in Congress to help him to that end?
Well, I thank you for that question. I have worked with the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration on a very pro-nuclear portfolio. All three secretaries, major secretaries of energy, whether it was Moniz, Perry, or Granholm, have worked with me on those endeavors. So we have moved forward. There's bipartisan and bicameral support for that. I would expect that to continue under Secretary Wright, because I know that President Trump is infinitely pro-new nuclear. So that is important. So it's going to be a continuation of the funding model I have out for fiscal 25, built on fiscal 24. It's a good, solid pro-nuclear portfolio. Nuclear energy will be part of clean, carbon-free, reliable, resilient energy. So I think we're going to continue to work in that direction, build on what we have. America has moved into this space. We're strong in this space, but we do need to get better. Our foes are good at it. Our friends are good at it. So we need to continue to get better at it.
Donald Trump is on his way to Texas for the big SpaceX Starship launch. We're going to carry that here on Bloomberg around 5 o'clock. In our remaining moment, Congressman, from your perch on the Science Committee, how important is this flight test to succeed for Elon Musk and for NASA to continue their planning to go to Mars?
I had the privilege of meeting Elon Musk when President Trump brought him to our conference last week. And of course, what did I speak with Elon about? Nuclear energy. I gave him my card and I said, let's talk nuclear. But I applaud Elon with what he's done. I wish him every success in his endeavors in space. And I think NASA and the country and the world can learn from what he's doing. I applaud him. I compliment him, and I wish him future success.
Well, the chopsticks are going to be waiting, Congressman. We'll all be watching together. Chuck Fleischman, Republican from Tennessee, with us live from Capitol Hill. It's good to see you, sir. Thank you for the insights today on Bloomberg. 5 p.m. roughly to 5:30, by the way, is the window for that launch, and you better believe you'll hear it and see it here on Bloomberg Radio and on YouTube. We'll assemble our panel next. Jeannie Shanzano and Lisa Camuso-Miller with a lot to talk about from Ukraine to here in Washington, only on Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average lower, the S&P, NASDAQ. They are pushing higher in a volatile session marked by a flurry of geopolitical headlines. Got to keep it locked into Bloomberg radio and television for the latest. NVIDIA, meanwhile, climbing in the run-up to earnings tomorrow. NVIDIA shares up now by 2.5%. S&P up 13 at 5907 for the S&P. A gain now of 0.2%. We got the Dow down 78, down by about 0.2%, while NASDAQ is up 113, up by about 0.6%. 10-year 4.37%, the 2-year 4.26%. Spot gold up $18 the ounce, 26.30, up 0.7%. Crude up by 0.3%, 69.39 a barrel, and Bitcoin now up by almost 2%, 93,162 on Bitcoin. Federal Reserve data shows some Americans are in a credit crunch. With that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Consumer loan rejection rates rose to 21% this year, above pre-pandemic levels. Americans with credit scores under 680 are more likely to face rejections based on data from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Increases were across the board, from mixed auto loan applications to home mortgages and increases in credit card limits. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
And one other economic note, U.S. housing starts declined in October to the slowest pace in 3 months as hurricanes exacerbated an easing in construction activity more generally. Among housing stocks today, Toll Brothers, the home builders, little change, down less than 0.1%. KB Home down 0.2%. Pulte, though, up by 1.5%. Recapping, S&P up 13, up 0.2%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. And once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Watching Wall Street for us as we watch President Biden wrap his last G20. We talked to David Gura a little bit earlier, I should say, this hour in Rio. They are wrapping things up there. The communique is out. Joe Biden making some final remarks in Rio de Janeiro. A working lunch with President Lula da Silva. And then it's back to the White House tonight. Donald Trump is headed to Texas today. You might have heard me mention with Congressman Chuck Fleischman. On his way to Texas, Brownsville, for the big launch. This is SpaceX Starship, 5 p.m. Eastern Time is the start of the launch window. We're going to carry this for you. This is the latest flight test that you heard Donald Trump talking about. Remember the chopsticks on the last one? The booster comes back down, they catch it at the pad. All that's supposed to happen, and the weather is looking good. So between 5 and 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, you know, you can always count on Bloomberg to bring you these launches. This is a big one, though. You've got the president-elect there with the buddy-in-chief, Elon Musk, all watching the launch. And a lot of this, of course, has to do with our return to the moon, with our return to Mars, and each stage, each flight test is critically important to stay on track. So we're going to have a lot more from Texas a little bit later on today, as reality may be setting in at Mar-a-Lago. Not about SpaceX or Elon Musk, but about Matt Gaetz. Headline of the New York Times, Gaetz may not be confirmed. Trump admits he's pushing him and others anyway. Maggie Haberman, Jonathan Swan reporting that Donald Trump has been on the phone, specifically calling senators to pressure them, knowing that we may have even odds here in getting Matt Gaetz, the now former Florida congressman, approved to run the Department of Justice. It's where we start our conversation with our political panel. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino is back with us today, Senior Democracy Fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, of course, Democratic analyst and Bloomberg Politics contributor. And Lisa Camuso Miller, Republican strategist, former RNC Communications Director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Prepare for a great conversation. Great to see both of you here. Jeannie, your thought on this. We've been talking about Matt Gaetz since last week when the name first dropped here. Donald Trump is hearing all the same stuff that we are, but is now appealing directly to senators. Will it work?
We don't know yet. You know, the reality is that these allegations, particularly for somebody who is nominated to be the Attorney General of the United States, the chief law enforcement official, whether these allegations are true or not, and of course he denies them, these are disqualifying. I mean, think back 20 years. Tom Daschle loses the nomination because he didn't pay taxes. You know, Bill Richardson, that's how it used to work. Now we've got somebody who is accused of these, you know, crimes, if they are true. And again, he says they are not. These would be disqualifying. But the reality is you've got members of Congress who say, or the Senate who say that they want to give the president's nominees a fair hearing. And we'll have to see if that's true. But the reality is that Donald Trump hears what we're all hearing, and that is these are disqualifying allegations.
Less than even odds of being confirmed to the Senate. The line in Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan's column, Lisa. Enter Elon Musk, who is not only supporting Matt Gaetz, but he takes to Twitter, to X, and writes, he is the Judge Dredd America needs to clean up a corrupt system and put powerful bad actors in prison. Gaetz will be our hammer of justice. How comic book is this going to get in the next couple of weeks?
Well, Jill, we're definitely on another side of things. There's no question about it. And the thing about this nomination is that I think we're all waiting to see, right? There are definitely a lot of questions about whether or not Matt Gaetz can be confirmed, but also, too, don't forget that we're living in a very different time. Donald Trump has got the control of the Senate, he's got control of the House, but he also really likes to win. And so, to me, I think that he's hearing everything that we're hearing. I think he's still very much behind Matt Gaetz as a candidate for Attorney General. He's going to do everything he can to see that he can make that happen. But also, too, he's not going to go far enough. He's not going to go so far that he's going to lose that nomination himself and have to go back to the drawing board. So I think a lot of things are up in the air. Like Jeannie said, I think we just don't yet know. So we have to continue to watch. But I do think that there are a lot of things in his favor that are happening. And that is that he's got people like Elon Musk. And he's got, by the way, the support of the base of the party really behind him, right? I had someone tell me the other day that even the folks who aren't really paying very close attention to Matt Gaetz are saying that they're in favor of him because he is an outside of the box candidate. And so that too is something that has to be fueling Donald Trump's thought process as it goes through and as he continues to make phone calls to the U.S. Senate about confirming.
Now, of course, the Ethics Committee is going to meet tomorrow about whether or not to release this report. Jeannie, Speaker Johnson says no. It would set a horrible precedent for former members, even though there are some instances where this has happened before. But the top Republican on this committee, the chair, Michael Guest, says he doesn't care, and the panel will act independent of whatever the speaker says based on when they meet. The ranking member, his Democratic counterpart, Susan Wild, says she wants the report out. So we can all agree this is going to happen, right? Whether it takes place publicly for the committee or the lawyer is out there talking on behalf now of 4 women apparently connected to Matt Gaetz, or as you put yesterday in the FBI report. So this information will be available to senators who make this decision, right?
Oh, it absolutely will be. I mean, the FBI check alone, they're going to be able to pick up as much, if not more, quite frankly, than was picked up in the House Ethics. The House Ethics Committee, we don't know if they'll release it, but don't forget there's 10 members of the committee, 28 or 29 staffers. The ranking member on the Democratic side, you just mentioned, Wild, lost re-election. You know, what's to stop any of these people from releasing to journalists, you know, parts of this or in full? So I think we get it out here. But I think part of the troubling aspect of all of this, and whether we're talking about, you know, this nominee, Matt Gaetz, or Peter Hegseth in DOD, is we are not talking about qualifications to run these departments. All of the focus has been on these allegations of sexual misconduct and otherwise, obviously disqualifying. But it should also be distinguished that these are massive departments. I mean, the DOD alone, $800 billion annual budget. What qualifications does somebody like Pete Hegseth have to run that department? 2 million people he'd be responsible for that the DOD employs. Maybe he has those qualifications, but we don't hear about them or talk about them because all of the focus, once again, has been on these, sort of really troubling allegations, disqualifying, but not having to do with the qualifications of these individuals. And that's not to mention Tulsi Gabbard, or of course, maybe the worst offender, RFK Jr., who has, zero qualifications in the area of health and human services. A good attorney on environment, but not health and human services.
You start to wonder if Matt Gaetz, the best thing that ever happened to Pete Hegseth or RFK Jr., Lisa, considering the fact that Hegseth reportedly paid to settle a sexual assault case. Lisa, you worked for a Republican speaker in Denny Hastert. You know how this stuff works. When Mike Johnson says, I don't want the ethics report released, what does that mean when the chairman says we're going to do it anyway?
Well, Joe, there used to be a joke in Washington. I don't know that it's still the case, but if you want a story told, tell somebody on Capitol Hill. And it certainly is the case. I mean, these kinds of things definitely have a way of making themselves into the conversation. But, and I'm reflecting on what Jeannie said. I'm reflecting on sort of the way we've covered Donald Trump for all these years. The truth is that I think we're falling into the same trap. And that is that, yes, there is a process for confirmation. There is a process that involves the FBI, involves background checks and all of those other things. And ordinarily, those are disqualifiers. But look, in a resounding way, the American electorate voted for Donald Trump and put him back in office in charge of the biggest, in the biggest job there ever was. So to me, we also have to reflect on the fact that this is sort of a continuation of a conversation we probably need to be having. And that's, what is it that's qualifying and disqualifying in these jobs in this day and age? Do I think that we should refer back to the way that things once were? Absolutely. And Jeannie and I and you, Joe, have been watching this long enough to know that that's the way that this business is done. And thank goodness there are processes in place that will hopefully catch some of these candidates that perhaps aren't the best qualified for these jobs. But also, too, let's not fall into the trap of following all of the side noise and the outside noise that's conflating the fact that Donald Trump is still fighting for all of these candidates. And so far, his record has been pretty good over the course of the last couple of months and years.
So I'm glad you said all of that, Lisa. Finish the thought then. What are the chances that all three, Hegseth, Gaetz, RFK Jr., are confirmed? Because Donald Trump says he's got the mandate to make that happen.
You've heard me say it too. I think the rules are different. I think the playbook is different. And I think that, if Donald Trump has his mind set on getting these people into place, he's going to do what he has in his power as the president of the United States to do that. At the horror and the shock of all the people inside of Washington, D.C., including myself, who are concerned about these people as candidates that should be in these roles. So to me, I think that the chance, if there's, goodness knows, my crystal ball is as clear as anybody's in this town, Joe, but I'll say this, that I think that it's very possible that we could see these kinds of people get into these roles more readily than ever before in the history of the United States.
Yeah. Well, all right, Jeannie, what role do Democrats then play on the committees that are having these hearings? Do Democrats throw their hands up and say, you know what, you want this team? Go ahead. Let's see where you are in 2 years. Clear them. Or is there going to be a real throwdown, a real fight by Democrats knowing that they will likely be confirmed anyway?
Well, they will continue to be the loyal opposition. I think you look at the Judiciary Committee. Poor 91-year-old Chuck Grassley is the incoming chair of that, has got to manage this. And you're going to see Dick Durbin and the Democrats. They are going to call, if Matt Gaetz comes to the Judiciary Committee, they will call witnesses. They will make this a spectacle. They will make Republicans go on the record and say they support somebody who is charged with sex with an underage woman or girl, who has paid for sex, who has used illegal drugs, all of these allegations. So these are going to be hearings of the kind, just think back to Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill. Yep. That's what they will do. And that's what the Republicans are so not looking forward to. That's one reason why some of them want the report to come out. They're hoping that they can avoid having to go through this hearing. But these will be hearings for all of us to watch and all of us to see. But again, what we won't be talking about is what Donald Trump is saying he's going to be doing, including yesterday, that he will use the U.S. military to deport people who are here illegally. Regardless of what you think about immigration, the use of the U.S. military domestically, that is an enormous change in the way we run this country. He said on Truth Social yesterday, absolutely true, when somebody posted he would do that. And that has sort of gone sort of under-reported, under-discussed, just imagined what that would be like, the U.S. military out in full force, because of the real nasty allegations we're hearing on the other side. And that should be balanced. We should try to balance both of them. But I'll tell you, if these hearings come to fruition, there will be no balancing. We will all be all in on Matt Gaetz, because it's going to be wild.
Oh my God, yeah. Just wait to cover these hearings. This is a great panel and a really smart conversation. I appreciate it from both of you. Really smart insights that you're only going to hear on this program. Balance of Power. Our great panel, Jeannie Shanzano and Lisa Camuso-Miller, will stay with us in our second hour as we welcome our global television audience. A lot more with the panel ahead, as well as our conversation in our second hour with Congressman Sean Casten, the Democrat from Illinois, will join us only here on Blue.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The war in Ukraine escalates on its 1,000th day. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as Moscow announces a new nuclear doctrine after Ukraine used U.S.-provided ATACMS missiles offensively against Russia. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. Kaylee, this is all happening as President Biden wraps the G20 summit in Rio and as Donald Trump tries to assemble his own national security team.
Yeah, of course, we've gotten a lot of names in that regard from the president-elect already. He is still keeping us waiting on his Treasury Secretary selection. We'll bring you the latest on that this hour. And we have to talk about the controversy surrounding a few of his nominees, including the Republican former congressman from Florida, Matt Gaetz. Is now a letter signed by 100 Democrats, led by Representative Sean Casten of Illinois, goes out encouraging the Ethics Committee to release their report into Mr. Gaetz. And the congressman from Illinois, Sean Casten, will be joining us in just a few minutes.
He sure will. The Democrat from Illinois will be with us here on Balance of Power, and pretty interesting as the chair of the Ethics Committee, of course, a Republican, says he will act independently in releasing the report into Matt Gaetz, assuming the committee moves in that direction, Kaylee, despite Speaker Johnson saying no, that would set a horrible precedent for former members. So we've got a bit of a standoff here, it looks like.
Yeah, and we'll go live to Capitol Hill in just a moment. But we begin, as always, with a live look at Wall Street. Charlie Pellet checking on the markets from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Kaylee Lyons. And here's what's going on. We got the Dow lower, the S&P, NASDAQ. They're both higher right to the numbers, with the S&P up 9 now, up by about 0.2%. Stocks shaking off war angst ahead of NVIDIA's results tomorrow. The Dow, though, down 131 now, down 0.3%. NASDAQ up 99, a gain there of 0.5%. Putting it all in context, we got the S&P up by 0.1%. Your 10-year, 4.38%. Spot gold up 0.6%, 26.27 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude 69.32 a barrel. WTI up 0.2%. Bitcoin cannot ignore the move there, up 1.7%, now at 92,864 on a Bitcoin. Sports, briefly, the Jets have fired GM Joe Douglas as the team continues to disappoint fans who entered the season with high expectations, that according to ESPN. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Charlie will have tabs on the markets for us throughout the hour here as we cover politics from Washington, D.C. We saw a bit of a swoon in the market earlier with the news from Ukraine using the ATACMS missiles provided by the U.S. offensively against Russia, which is announcing a new nuclear doctrine, though it does seem that the markets have settled a bit since then. Turning to the matter at hand in Washington, that's the transition, of course, in the looming confirmation battles for some of the more controversial figures who Donald Trump has named, beginning with former Congressman Matt Gaetz, tapped to run the Department of Justice to be the next Attorney General. As Kaylee mentioned, Congressman Sean Casten, a Democrat from Illinois, is leading a letter from House Democrats urging the Ethics Committee to release its report into Matt Gaetz, knowing that the Ethics Committee will be voting on this matter tomorrow and that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has called on the committee to keep that report under wraps. Congressman Casten joins us now live from Capitol Hill. Congressman, it's good to see you. This report seems to be the worst kept secret in Washington. Do you know what's in there? Would it keep Matt Gaetz from being the next Attorney General?
So the report has not been released. The Ethics Committee, by tradition, keeps a tight hold on these things. We've seen the leaks that have come out, as you have. We've seen the stories about people saying that 17-year-old girls were drugged and statutorily raped at parties by Matt Gaetz. We've not seen what's in the report. The Ethics Committee has the authority to release that report, and I think what scares a lot of us is that we saw the last time that Trump was in the White House that he not only surrounds himself with sexual predators, people who are credibly accused of sexual assault, but suppresses that information. Remember, he suppressed the FBI investigation into Brett Kavanaugh. Remember that Donald Trump himself is an adjudicated rapist. And so if we don't compel the release of that information, we have no guarantee that a Republican-led Senate will actually care about whether an Attorney General of the United States has been accused of sexual assault. So we need to get the information out there. We need to make sure that the Senate has the tools to fulfill their advice and consent function, and then make sure that we put public pressure on them to ensure that they do.
Well, of course, we should note that the former Congressman Matt Gaetz has denied any wrongdoing amid these allegations, and even attorneys for two of the alleged people that had relations with Matt Gaetz have said their interactions were consensual. But Congressman, as we consider this here, knowing that the Speaker has said this would set a bad precedent as Mr. Gaetz is no longer a member of the House of Representatives, is there a precedent concern here? Could the House Ethics Committee in the future be used in a way that it was not intended to if this is done?
Look, number one, the House Ethics Committee does have a history. In past years, they have released reports after members have come out. Number two, make no mistake, Matt Gaetz is an extremely smart guy. He is also less than completely honest. All of us understood that he resigned early in order to avoid this report coming to light. If he is nervous about what's in the report, that speaks volumes. And with respect to Mr. Johnson, I would simply point out that Mr. Johnson told us when he was running for Speaker, if you want to know what I believe, just read the Bible. When Jesus said, what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, I wonder who Mike Johnson actually is thinking of by the least of these. If you have somebody, Donald Trump raped a woman, is Mike Johnson going to look out for that, or is he going to be a rubber stamp? Does he care that there are credible challenges against Matt Gaetz? I wish this didn't sound partisan. I wish that we trusted the Republicans in the House and Senate to defend the least of these. But the fact that somebody is saying, I am innocent, trust me, and please don't disclose the information, a little dubious.
Congressman, we heard from Elon Musk, who, of course, is playing a pretty big role in the transition of this administration, apparently will play a large role once the administration is off and running. He says that Matt Gaetz, quote, is the Judge Dredd. America needs to clean up a corrupt system and put powerful bad actors in prison. Gaetz, he says, will be our hammer of justice. That's a direct quote, going on to say that the allegations that we're talking about here, quote, amount to less than nothing, unquote. How would you respond to Elon Musk?
Look, Elon Musk is not an elected official. Elon Musk does not represent anybody, and hardly, I think, is a voice of reason in our society. He said that his own goal is to go live on Mars. Okay, fine. The only reason we're talking about Elon Musk is because he's rich. We have a separate question. Do we want the Attorney General of the United States to be somebody who has a dedicated commitment to ensuring that the law applies to every American equally without preference? That seems a very low bar. If your view is that the Attorney General's job is to be some comic book figure that is out to implement retribution, whatever that is a deeply anti-American idea.
Congressman, we may care about Elon Musk because he is the richest man in the world, but he also happens to be a massive government contractor, including agreements between his company SpaceX and NASA. We're expected to see today, and the president-elect is expected to attend the launch of a heavy rocket, the sixth Starship launch, which of course is integral to NASA's efforts to hopefully one day get back to the moon and then maybe to Mars. And I wonder how concerned you are about Elon Musk's more active role, it seems, with this transition with this president-elect, knowing that the government is reliant on him for many such endeavors.
You know, I think there's a larger conversation there that is the concern about our campaign finance system in the wake of the Citizens United decision. The government that our founders intended, the government that our laws were designed prior to Citizens United, is you had to disclose if you were spending money to elect political figures. There is an emoluments clause in the Constitution. You cannot be independently profiting, and we've hidden all that in the guts of our campaign finance system. A functioning Congress going into the next term, given all the circumstances you just described, where the richest person in the world put hundreds of millions of dollars to elect someone into government and is then running to get those contracts, a Congress fulfilling its duty as a check and balance would have robust oversight, robust investigations, robust subpoenas, and if in fact SpaceX is the best technology to provide those needs and it's a fair and competitive bid process, there's nothing to worry about there. But I think we are all concerned, having seen what happened in the last Congress, that the leadership in the Republican Party is so petrified of making Donald Trump angry and so unwilling to stand up for those constitutional principles that we have to ask this question of, is there corruption happening in the light of day that will be allowed to continue, which ruins this beautiful American republic that all of us benefit from. This is bigger than just Elon Musk. It is a question of, like, do we want to make sure that there is no cash for favors in our politics? Congress has the ability to oversight and protect against that. I hope that we do.
Well, Congressman, knowing that Elon Musk will have the ear of the president, do you find a silver lining potentially in what he might steer Donald Trump to when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the development of electric vehicles, for instance? And is there an opportunity to collaborate on nuclear when this new Congress and this new administration begin?
We'll see. Speculating on an unappointed, unconfirmed person who's whispering in the ear of a political figure, I'm not sure that's hugely productive. I don't think that Elon Musk's involvement in politics is because he wanted to convince Donald Trump to love electric vehicles, right? I think that's a third-order question. I do think that a lot of us in the energy community are broadly concerned that the last time Trump was in the White House, he fought to raise the price of oil. You will recall he called the Saudis and said, "I need you to curtail production to raise the price of oil because it's hurting our oil manufacturers." He's got voices in his head who are saying we're losing market share in the United States. Coal consumption in the United States is collapsing. Oil consumption is flat. They want to export because they can't compete in the United States. What we really need in the White House is someone who is committed to competitive markets, to making sure that the lowest cost technology wins. And what all of us know is that if you have a solar panel on your roof, you don't pay for electricity anymore. If you have a transmission wire that can connect your cheap electricity to a higher priced part of the grid, then markets work. And I think what we also know is that the Trump administration is going to work very hard to raise the price of energy to protect the oil and gas sector that can't compete. And that's not only bad for the climate, it's also bad for the economy. What influence Musk might have with electric vehicles, I think, is a third-order impact beyond that larger question of the stress that our economy is going to feel under a Trump administration.
Well, Congressman, before we can get there to the incoming administration, there is this session of Congress to finish out in the spending fight that needs to be fought. Obviously, we're facing a deadline here of December 20th. In what form do you expect ultimately a shutdown aversion will take, and where does $100 billion in requested disaster relief fit into the picture?
Well, I think we all heard Johnson say this week that he wanted to do a short-term continuing resolution that would put the disaster package in there. What we've all struggled with through this whole session is that there's a war within the Republican Party between itself. I think its Freedom Caucus would like to oppose any spending package. The more sort of Main Street ends of the Republican Party would like to negotiate this in good faith. If I had to guess right now, I'd say that they punt until the next Congress through a CR. But we'll see. I think they're having a lot of fights within themselves on how to get through there. And we've basically run this entire year on a continuing resolution, arguably the last 2 years on a continuing resolution, as a result of the fact that the Republican Party, particularly in the House, has struggled with governance. And so we just keep limping along and kicking through last year's priorities or the year before's priorities. I expect that will continue through this term, but I would love to be pleasantly surprised.
All right, Congressman, we appreciate your time. That is the Democrat from Illinois, Sean Casten, joining us live from Capitol Hill. And now we want to bring in our political panel today. Jeannie Shanzano is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, alongside Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC communications director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Lisa, I'll come to you first, as this spending battle, of course, is framed around the idea of what Donald Trump will be inheriting. Is a 3-month CR that would bring this spending fight to March really better for an incoming president than a clean slate?
Kayleigh, I think that everybody that's looking at this is looking at it in a pragmatic way, right? How quickly can we fund the government through a transition at a time when we are going to see tremendous amount of change? And so I think a lot of this has to do with what can get done. I mean, you and I and Joe and Jeannie have been around long enough to know that this is a process that always takes much longer than it ought to. And so to me, the CR that can get us to March would definitely make for a better transition, especially for the president, in spite of the fact that he has priorities. It gets us to a place to March where we can get through the first, nearly almost the first 100 days in a way that the government can be funded and opportunity can then be presented to go forward.
Is there an advantage for Democrats here, Jeannie? Is there an ask, whether it's the supplemental for emergency storm relief? Is there something that Joe Biden can ask for in this supplemental request, or is this really a Republican story from here?
You know, it's primarily a Republican story. We heard, as you just pointed out, Biden asking for the storm relief, desperately needed. But I think the bigger picture here is just what the congressman said. The most likely scenario is we continue, unfortunately, as a nation, to limp forward under continuing resolutions. And I'm convinced that is going to change in March, that it's going to change in September. I mean, your entire conversation with the congressman was so revealing because it just shows you how bitterly divided Congress remains. And when Congress remains this divided, very little gets done, from the most basic, like funding our government and budgeting, passing nominees and confirming the president's appointments, to other things that need to happen. And that, I think, is probably going to be the story. And, you were talking a lot about Elon Musk. How do you cut $2 trillion from this government? Good luck, Elon Musk. He is much better off landing these spaceships in space anywhere than he is cutting $2 trillion from this government, because it's going to have to work through Congress. And we can just hear how it is going to, just trickle. So if I was Elon Musk, I would keep being first buddy and run screaming for the exits from this thing.
I want to quickly bring in some news here in our final moments, Lisa. We were watching New York, where Donald Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. His sentencing that was due to happen next week has been postponed. Now, the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, says they'll fight to dismiss, they will fight the attempt to dismiss the case on as a result of his reelection, but are open to delaying any proceedings while he is in the White House. What would the point even be, Lisa, of revisiting this 4 years from now?
Haley, I have no idea. I mean, this, if nothing else, it makes this smell a lot more political than it probably is. And that, to me, is the kind of thing that and also Alvin Bragg is looking for a scalp. I mean, he's looking for an opportunity to make his own hard work and the time that his entire office has spent on this be rewarded for the work that they know is good. And so I don't know. To me, this seems like one of those things that is going to definitely fall off the priority list for New York. It's going to fall way to the back of any priority list as it relates to anything, because really, as you asked earlier, as you asked Jeannie, this is absolutely the Republican show. It's going to dominate. The White House is virtually speechless. I've heard nothing from the White House about anything that's gone on. And now, in a lame duck opportunity for them, they should be doing everything they can to make all kinds of things happen. But as it relates to New York, as it relates to what's happening in these criminal cases and all of these cases, I think you're going to find that all of them are going to wither and die.
Great conversation with a great panel today. Lisa Camuso-Miller and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you so much both for the insights. As we turn to a new record, Bitcoin record high, more than $93,500. With the Trump trade in mind, we turn next to what's happening abroad today. The 1,000th day of the war in Ukraine comes with escalation.
1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks shaking off war angst ahead of NVIDIA's results tomorrow. But before we get to the Dow, the S&P and NASDAQ cannot ignore the surge in Bitcoin. Bitcoin setting a record today of more than 93,500. Bitcoin's previous record was reached November 13th. Right now we do have Bitcoin advancing by 2%, 93,225 on Bitcoin. Dow Industrials down 104. That is a drop of 0.2%. S&P 500 index up 13, up 0.2%, while NASDAQ up 130 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, a gain now of 0.7%. 10-year at 4.37%, the 2-year 4.26%. Spot gold up $17 the ounce, $26.29. That is a gain of 0.7%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.1%, 69.25 a barrel on West Texas Intermediate crude. It is Bitcoin that's trading at 93,240 right now. Bitcoin at a record up by 2%. Super Micro computer shares are surging 28% after the company hired a new auditor and filed a plan to come into compliance with NASDAQ listing requirements. Again, Super Micro up by 28%. Rafael Nadal has lost at the Davis Cup in what could be his last match before retirement, and the Jets are now confirming that they have fired GM Joe Douglas as the team continues to disappoint fans who entered the season with high expectations. Recapping, S&P up 12. That is a gain now of 0.2%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet running us through the trading action on this Tuesday. Thank you so much. As we mark on this Tuesday 1,000 days of war between Russia and Ukraine. And this deep into this conflict, things do seem to be escalating after the U.S. granted Ukraine permission to use U.S.-made weapons for longer-range strikes into Russia. And Ukraine took advantage of that newly granted privilege by striking a military base in Russian territory, leading Moscow to respond with threat regarding nuclear weapons. Putin signing a decree allowing Russia to fire nuclear weapons in response to conventional attacks, including things like drone strikes. So at a time in which this feels like it's getting a whole lot hotter, we heard from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky about a path toward this being over.
We must push Russia toward just peace. Every blow and every threat from Russia must be met with firm sanctions. For 1,000 days, it has been crucial to radically reduce Russia's ability to fund its war through oil sales.
Speaking to the European Parliament earlier today, quite the reaction from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, reacting to the use of those ATACMS missiles that Kaylee just mentioned. Quote, "We will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia, and we will act accordingly," unquote. That's where we begin with Bloomberg's David Gura, who's still in Rio de Janeiro, where they are just now wrapping the G20 summit, Joe Biden's last G20. David, this is the topic on the ground there today. What are you hearing?
President Biden making his way to the airport. He is done with this summit. But those words from Sergei Lavrov had a seismic effect on this summit while it was wrapping up today. Everyone was listening. Indeed, it moved markets when he spoke about the changes to the Russian nuclear doctrine and the fact that he saw the move as escalatory. You know, it's interesting. The White House didn't immediately confirm this. I watched an interview yesterday that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, did with the PBS NewsHour. He wouldn't confirm that the U.S. was giving those missiles to Ukraine and allowing them to use them explicitly. Of course, we did see that overnight. We had confirmation from Russia, but not from Ukraine. And I should say Volodymyr Zelensky wanted to be here for this event, wanted to make his case for continued multilateral support of his effort to fight off Russia in his home country. And that request for information was rebuffed by President Lula here of Brazil. But this has come up over and over again on meetings on the sidelines and really shaped the last day of this session. There was a pivotal bilateral meeting this morning between President Xi of China and Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany. As we've been talking about, Chancellor Scholz, Olaf Scholz had a conversation with Vladimir Putin a few days ago, and he was briefing world leaders, including President Xi, about this. But there is this variable here that looms large, guys. Sort of what President Biden is able to do in terms of setting policy, allowing for the use of these ammunitions and weapons, and what's going to happen in just a couple of months' time when he leaves the White House and President Trump comes back.
All right, Bloomberg correspondent David Gura still live in Rio de Janeiro for us. Thank you so much. Now, as we consider the words of Sergei Lavrov today, he also said that we are strongly in favor of doing everything not to allow nuclear war to happen at the same time that this nuclear-oriented decree was signed by the Russian president. So I wonder to what extent we take those words at face value.
I don't know how you square those two. There are questions about whether this bluster might be an attempt to take advantage of this lame duck session that we're in right now in advance of Donald Trump taking office. But this is something that we can only wonder right now. Remarkable, though, to think that President Zelensky waited only hours after Joe Biden gave him permission to use those missiles.
Yeah, pretty incredibly quick in terms of action here, though they had been waiting for this kind of move from the U.S. administration, for this permission to be granted for some time. So we wanted to get into all of this with Kelly Grieco. She's a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and an expert in the weapons of war. Kelly, would love to hear from you on just what you make of the escalatory nature, it seems, we've seen from both sides in just the last 24 hours. How does Ukraine respond to the threat of Russia saying, if you strike us again, we could use a nuclear weapon? Does that mean this might be the first and only time the Ukraine used these ATACMS in this way?
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I will say that I'm not surprised by the Russian response. They had signaled earlier that this could actually be the response over the summer. They had discussed that they were revising their nuclear doctrine to lower the nuclear threshold for conventional attacks. And so what we saw today was essentially a confirmation of that, signing the order that it is now official policy. I think, it's interesting here. We're playing a very dangerous game of chicken on both sides, essentially, to see which side's going to blink first and stand down. Whether, my tendency is to think that the Ukrainians will be likely to try to call Putin's bluff. I think the question will be whether the Biden administration and also European allies are prepared to call his bluff in this way, or we'll see it as perhaps this is a step too far and it's worth backing down.
Well, I'm struck by the response, which was a non-response by the U.S. It's like Joshua in war games. The only way to win is not to play. Kelly, was that the right angle for the U.S. government today?
Yes, I think it was, because it does allow for, especially if we decide to back down and that maybe this is going to be a one-off, I think it allows us to do it in a way that it creates some ambiguity so we don't have as much of a reputational cost if we decide to revise this policy. So if we've never confirmed that we authorized this, that these were actually, the ATACMS that were used, and it doesn't happen again, it's sort of an easier way, I think, to manage a reversal of the policy. Without sort of, taking a reputational hit. So I think that was very smart.
Well, and when we consider the U.S.'s decision-making here to allow Ukraine to use these weapons at longer range and strike Russian territory, that's not necessarily being granted by all allies of Ukraine alike, Kelly. Germany, for example, and the Chancellor Olaf Scholz still incredibly reluctant to allow Ukraine use of their Taurus long-range missile systems. There's been a lot of talk about that in the last few days. What would providing those weapons to Ukraine mean differently, or is this kind of exactly the same scenario-wise as the U.S. decision on ATACMS?
Yes, it's exactly the same. And, the Germans have been much more cautious in what they provided, but I think it's worth noting that even our French and British allies that have been, I would say, more forward-leaning in providing longer-range systems to the Ukrainians have still not provided permission to use those weapons on Russian territory. And I think Putin's nuclear threats will certainly probably cause them to pause that rather than follow suit with the United States in that regard. But I think the really important thing here to mention is that none of these long-range systems, because they're only available in very small numbers, are likely to actually transform Ukraine's what Ukraine can accomplish in the war right now. It's in a very tough position, largely because it lacks sufficient manpower to hold the front, and it's being gradually pushed back by the Russians. And these long-range strikes are not going to change that reality. And so, you do have to wonder, is it worth the escalation risks here, given what it can actually accomplish militarily?
Well, I guess I'd ask you that. What kind of damage can President Zelensky do? What kind of ground could Ukraine gain with the use of these weapons in time to strengthen its hand at the negotiating table, realizing that's a pretty short window, it looks like, for when Donald Trump comes into office?
Yeah, I actually don't think this is about Ukraine gaining more ground. I think it's actually an attempt to try to save ground that Ukraine has, and particularly the Kursk region, where Ukraine went in August and captured this Russian territory in this surprise operation. And the Russians are gearing up to, it seems, take back that territory. There's about 50,000 troops in the Kursk area, including North Koreans. And so I think part of the decision here was to try to allow the Ukrainians to be able to conduct these long-range strikes in the Kursk area only, so that they could hit supply depots, ammunition storage, any concentrations of troops to try to disrupt those Russian operations. And hopefully, if Ukraine can hold on to that Kursk territory, they could use it as a bargaining chip at the negotiating table.
Kelly, I want to ask you about another development today. The IAEA saying that Iran has agreed to stop producing uranium enriched to the level at which it's required for nuclear weapons, that 60% production level. They say they've implemented measures aimed at stopping the increase of Iran's stockpile. But I wonder just the status of the stockpile as it is, even if they're taking these steps. Kelly, how much does Iran already have at its disposal if it wants to move forward with weapons?
Yes, I mean, most estimates that I've heard from, nuclear experts that watch Iran closely is that they're very close, probably, months away if they wanted to from being able to have sufficient amounts and be able to create, a nuclear weapon. I think it's a really interesting signal that they're sending, kind of extending an olive branch, it seems, in some ways. And it's interesting this comes after the reporting we heard about Musk meeting with the Iranians. It's, I think, an important signal, and I'd be curious to see how the future Trump administration reacts.
Well, considering the potential impact of the future Trump administration and seeing the ceasefire struck in Lebanon that was framed as some sort of a gift for the incoming president, do you see all of the hot wars, Ukraine, you can add what's happening in Israel to the list here, potentially resolving or at least advancing to the next phase under a new White House?
Yeah, I mean, it is really something to watch, isn't it? That we've had these wars, certainly for the last year, 2 very active wars, one in Europe, one in the Middle East. The Ukraine war, of course, has gone on longer. And right as it's winding, Biden's administration is winding down, a lot of these parties are now thinking that they're better off negotiating, knowing that the Trump administration is coming. And so I think there's something here that we should be thinking about as the United States about whether we have actually inadvertently perhaps enabled these wars to drag on because we haven't really provided any restraints, or not very many restraints, on our allies in these wars, and whether that really served our interests and served either Israeli or Ukrainian interests. And so it is quite remarkable that we might actually see at least some kind of freezing of these conflicts pretty soon into a Trump administration.
Some big questions to answer. Kelly, it's great to have you back. Kelly Grieco, Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center. Thank you so much for the insights and analysis as we track what's happening in Ukraine on this 1,000th day of its war with Russia. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power as we transition to the economy next. An important conversation with Joe Lavorgna, live from New York, here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average lower, S&P, NASDAQ. They are both advancing right now. Stocks shaking off war angst ahead of NVIDIA's earnings tomorrow after the bell. Right to the numbers. We got the S&P up 19, up 0.3%. The Dow, though, in the red, down 87, drop there of 0.2%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 159 now, up 0.9%. The 10-year, 4.37%, with the 2-year, 4.26%. Gold up $16 the ounce, up 0.6%. West Texas Intermediate crude now lower, down 0.1%, 69.09 a barrel. Bitcoin, big story there. Another record today, 93,787 right now on Bitcoin, up 2.6%. Housing starts declined in October to the slowest pace in 3 months as hurricanes exacerbated and easing in construction activity more generally. Housing starts decreased 3.1% last month to a 1.31 million annualized rate, reflecting a steep decline in the South, as according to government data out today. Among some of the housing stocks we track at this hour, Toll Brothers down 0.2%, KB Home up 0.2%, and Pulte also higher today, up by just about 1.5%. Sports, the Jets have fired GM Joe Douglas as the team continues to disappoint fans who entered the season with high expectations. So again, recapping, S&P up 19, up 0.3%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Limes.
All right, Charlie Pellet with a look at the Tuesday trade. Thank you so much. And I'm just realizing as it's Tuesday, that means we're officially now 2 weeks since Election Day. 2 weeks that for Joe Matthew and myself felt more like 2 months, possibly.
Oh, no. They know.
2 years.
I think that goes for a nation.
Yeah, because a lot has happened since we learned that Donald Trump would become the president-elect, as he has wasted no time filling out what his second administration will look like. But he is spending time on one role in particular, maybe more time than he first intended.
That's right.
On Treasury Secretary, after a lot of infighting has played out quite publicly.
Yeah, this has been quite remarkable to witness. We're still not done.
Yeah.
We don't know who will be the Treasury Secretary, but we do know who will not. And that's because Howard Lutnick, who was said to be on the short list, of course, co-chair of the transition, has been named Commerce Secretary. That's the most recent one that we got here, according to reports. And Nancy Cook has been driving a lot of our coverage here on the transition for us from Bloomberg here in Washington, our senior national correspondent for politics with us at the table. Nancy, it's great to see you. We've got to be getting close to the big one here, right? For Bloomberg, at least, it's the big one. Usually you see Treasury come first because that's the less controversial pick. Why is it so hard this time?
There has just been a tremendous amount of infighting over the Treasury pick that has really delayed it. And so a week or so ago, Scott Bessent, who I know you have had on the show before, was really seen as the front runner. Then Howard Lutnick decided, he is running the personnel side of the transition. He decided he wanted the job for himself and told President-elect Trump that. And basically, there's been sort of a lot of infighting within the transition team over who's going to get that post. Trump has grown tired of the leaks, tired of sort of the back and forth on this, and is now considering a whole new roster of new candidates who have not been involved in the infighting. So our reporting shows that he is supposed to meet with Kevin Warsh, who was a Fed governor, tomorrow. He's also supposed to meet with Mark Rowan of Apollo. Senator Bill Hagerty, who's been another guest of the show, is in the mix. And so really the pool has expanded as the infighting sort of dragged on for the week.
Well, and it did make me wonder when Bloomberg has reported this as well, though Donald Trump, of course, hasn't yet made it official that it could be Howard Lutnick for Commerce. If there's been so much jockeying between the two, if they're both to serve in the administration together, working toward economic goals, that might create some strife internally if they actually have to work together in that capacity. And I wonder if that actually means that if Lutnick gets a former cabinet role, that Bessent can't get one.
Well, we reported yesterday that they had offered Scott Bessent. They had spoken to him about both the Treasury position, but also there was talks about putting him in the White House at the National Economic Council. And so, they have floated different jobs for him. I think it's unlikely that the two of them both end up in the administration at this point. But again, the Trump team has not officially announced Lutnick yet. And so I think that, we won't be totally sure until we see that that announcement come from them directly.
National Economic Council, or Council of Economic Advisors, the two agencies, if you will, or the two groups inside the White House advising the president, it's been suggested might actually have more influence, play a greater role in the administration because they're in the White House with Donald Trump, which is exactly how he operates. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, well, Treasury Secretary is its own cabinet position.
Sure,
you know, you have a plane, you have a staff.
Yep.
You know, you're seen as sort of more of a principal and a peer, I would say, to the president. But the National Economic Council, you have to remember, in Trump's first term, was led by Larry Kudlow, who is one of Trump's favorite people. You know, he was in the running for Treasury Secretary as well, but sort of took himself out of it because he's a Fox News commentator, and I think didn't want to disrupt his life to that example. But that role, when Larry Kudlow occupied it, and even Gary Cohn before that, you know, was a real powerhouse because your office is in the White House. You're sort of in all those meetings. My question really for the economic policy making this Trump term is that it was so riddled with infighting last time, particularly in the trade space over what to do with tariffs, what to do on the policy towards China. You had some people who wanted, you know, tons of tariffs, some people who wanted more free trade. So I will be looking, once Trump announces his economic team, sort of where the fissures are, particularly on how these different players are going to view trade.
Well, and that makes the role of USTR very important, right? Would one of these who it doesn't get the Treasury position potentially get that one instead?
USTR is really an open question, and I think where Robert Lighthizer ends up is an open question. You know, our reporting shows that he does not want to go to USTR again, even though that's a role that, you know, he did quite well and effectively in the first Trump term. And so I don't think he's going to get Treasury Secretary. He doesn't want USTR again. Where does he land? Because he has been such a Trump ally. Same thing with Linda McMahon. She is the other co-chair of the transition. We know Trump has interviewed her for Commerce. If Lutnick actually ends up getting the official nod for Commerce, where does Linda McMahon go? So there's a lot of real loyalists in the Trump orbit who may end up without jobs.
Fascinating. Well, we know Nancy Cook will be covering all of it for us as the pieces move about the board here. Bloomberg National Politics reporter Nancy Cook. And we want to talk more about this kind of economic team and, frankly, what kind of policy it is they're really going to be pursuing once they are assembled. And turn back to Joe Livornia. He, of course, served in the first Trump White House as special assistant to the president and chief economist at the National Economic Council and is now chief economist with SMB Nikko Securities. He's joining us from New York. Joe, would love to just get your take on how you're watching all of this play out, as frankly some of the names that Nancy just told us seem to be in contention here, like Kevin Warsh, might actually have some conflict with Donald Trump when it comes to the approach around policies like tariffs, for example. What do you think?
So I thought Nancy did a very good job reporting, but to me, I don't see it as infighting at all. I actually think it's healthy debate, and the press, I think, sometimes treats anything that Mr. Trump or President-elect Trump says as catnip. And I think you've got a lot of healthy debates. And so I think the infighting thing is very much overhyped. I could tell you that when I was there, this was during the pandemic, there wasn't chaos, and that was typically the adjective people use. So I think we have to be a little bit more careful in terms of, I think, how we describe things. But in terms of the people, I mean, the president certainly has a great list of people who could take the role. I think what you're referring to as it relates to Kevin Warsh is a paper position he had back in 2011. The world has totally changed since then. So whether it's Kevin Warsh or Scott Bessent in complementary roles, I think the nation would be well served. But I think the point is that the president-elect is making a very thorough, thoughtful decision on who he wants, and we have to applaud the fact that he's moving with patience and thinking about it.
Joe, thank you for that. Considering all the motion here and the commotion and the reporting that you may or may not think is totally accurate, at least describing the mood at Mar-a-Lago. You've been there. You know what this is like. You were chief economist, National Economic Council. Are you loving sitting back here watching what's going on from your perch, or are you actually in conversation with the transition team about taking on another role in this new White House?
No, I'm lucky that I get to be an outside observer and have some insight into Washington. And most importantly, the markets are moving. And it's making my day job more fun and interesting. It's great already, but we're making it great again. Poor pun, but you know what I mean. But no, it's pretty interesting in terms of what happens. And I do think, the people that the president is considering for Treasury, I think what's important is they're not folks that I think would be market negative by any means. And the president needs to put someone there who can articulate his policies, be a spokesperson for the markets, and do it in a way that inspires confidence. And I think what you're seeing now with equities close to their all-time highs and the market and Treasury market, basically not selling off further, I think right now is a vote of confidence that whoever the president picks will be someone that investors are largely comfortable with.
Well, as we consider the markets here and the public companies that trade on them, Joe, we did get some news from the CFO of Walmart, who told CNBC today that if Donald Trump implements the tariffs as expected, Walmart will likely have to raise some prices. I know we've discussed this with you at length, but this points to the inflationary concerns many have. Yes. Joe, and I wonder how many price increases you would expect to see.
So I think what's very important is, again, as I said this, maybe there's 5 pillars of Trumponomics. One of them certainly is the tariffs, but also part of that is lower energy costs. And the energy share of the economy is larger than the imported goods share of the economy. And energy, if prices are down, has a more multiplicative effect in that it impacts other goods and prices, and lower costs actually can reduce the inflation rate. A tariff, theoretically, would be a one-off increase in the price level, so it's not inflationary. Moreover, what we saw from basically the 2017 to 2020 period is that producers largely, if not fully, absorbed that price increase. So to sound a bit like an economist, it depends on implementation. But I think people who are fixated on the tariffs as being inflationary and hurting, I think are missing the bigger picture and what the president-elect is trying to do, because it also involves deregulation, which is growth enhancing, lower tax rates on the corporate sector. And the intention is to increase productive capacity and supply, which lifts productivity and actually would lower inflation. So I don't like when people just fixate on one little narrow piece and don't look at the possible effects, the second and third order effects that tariffs may have that actually are not destabilizing or inflationary really in any appreciable way.
I'd like to ask you about Donald Trump's pick for Energy Secretary. Chris Wright, said to be an innovator when it comes to fracking. This is drill, baby, drill, right? Assuming he's confirmed, Joe, what will it mean for oil prices in, say, the first year of Donald Trump's administration? Because the president-elect has made some big promises to lower energy prices by half.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we're going to get lower energy costs, and I don't know where prices go. A lot will depend in part on the global economy and what the president decides to do with Iran and sanctions. So it's not just a U.S. phenomenon. But I do think there is going to be a very concerted effort to get energy production higher, to get gasoline prices back. I believe they averaged only around $2.50 a gallon under President Trump's first term. So if you can get prices down at the pump, that's savings that immediately go into middle and lower class pocketbooks, and people appreciate because, again, they could spend money on other goods and services. So energy costs are likely to fall. Where they go, I'm not sure at this point, but yes, you're correct. The drill, baby, drill mantra will be a day one initiative, and you'll see President Trump, through executive order, increase leasing and use of federal lands, exploration, offshore drilling. All those things will come back into the fold.
Well, we also expect that the president-elect, pretty soon after taking office, could use his executive order powers to address the border and migration. He confirmed yesterday reports that he'd look to use the military to enact the mass deportations or get those underway that he said he would on the campaign trail. How quickly do you think that would start to resonate in economic data, Jeff?
I don't think that immigration actually has had as big an effect on the economy as people think. It's not as if the people who are coming over illegally are answering a government questionnaire as to whether they're working. And I'd argue that the president's potential policies already have worked to slow foot traffic. And of course, border security implementation will be much stricter. So you'll see the crossings come down. What happens beyond that, I can't say. But I don't think this notion somehow we're going to get this leftward shift in the labor supply curve and of all this inflation, I think, is very misleading. You saw under Trump's first term, you saw immigration and border crossings fall to a de minimis level. And yet you had very little inflation. You still had very good real real wage growth. So I don't think this is going to be a factor impacting the larger economy or the labor market in particular.
Joe Lavorgna, SMBC, Nikko Securities America, a veteran of the first Trump White House. Joe, it's good to see you. Thank you for the insights, as always. Fascinating conversation, Kaylee, as we wait for the next big one. Of course, commerce to be official, but also Treasury. This is something we might be waiting the rest of the week for, it sounds like.
Yeah, remembering there's a whole team at play here, not just the Treasury Secretary, but the National Economic Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, the U.S. Trade Representative. There's a lot of names that we are eager to see. And if we have any news on it in the next few hours, we'll have more at 5 p.m. right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Yes, indeed, everybody. This is Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Carol Masser along with Tim Stenovec. We are live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. It is Tuesday, November 19th.
It's only Tuesday,
Time flies.
Masser.
I know. We've got a long week coming. Hey, stocks are up.
Yeah, the S&P 500 higher by half a percentage point. The NASDAQ composite up by more than 8%. Stocks volatile in the session, marked by geopolitical headlines. Those headlines certainly top of mind for us.
Yeah, but we're seeing some buying at this hour. We are pretty much at our best levels. All right. Anyway, those geopolitical headlines, no doubt about it, they are top of mind for us. So let's get to it. And that means ahead this hour, we're going to get the latest from the GTO is a car, isn't it?
I guess.
I don't know.
Where's Matt Miller when you need him?
Where is Matt Miller when we need him? G20, listen, they're wrapping up. I think Joe Biden already headed for his plane, heading home. Escalation in terms of the war between Russia and Ukraine, maybe the world. We are going to dig deep into it. A lot of serious issues at this hour.
Plus, a little closer to home, the job of Treasury Secretary still up in the air. It's a big job. And we're going to talk a little bit about why it's such an important job and really why we care who gets nominated.
Not just about the signature on your dollar bills. Also, breaking up Google's search monopoly. And we've got top picks from a top fund manager by way of small and mid caps.
And what an upbeat Walmart means ahead of the all-important holiday shopping season.
It's coming. All right, let's get to that market trade and that buying that we're seeing in just the last few minutes. Let's head things over to Charlie Bell.
All right, thank you very much. Best level of the day right now on the S&P 500 index, up 28, up 0.5%. Dow Industrials down 20, decline right now of just under 0.1%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index pushing higher as well. We got NASDAQ up 192 right now, NASDAQ up 1%. So stocks pushing higher. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares up 0.6%. 10-year 4.37%. The 2-year 4.26%. Gold up $18 the ounce, 26.30, up 0.7%. While West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.1%, 69.23 a barrel on WTI. Bitcoin, a record 93,689 as I speak, up 2.5%. But again, Bitcoin trading above 93,000 again at a record. Intuit and H&R Block shares tumbling after the Washington Post reported that the leaders of President-elect Donald Trump's Department of Government Efficiency discussed creating a new way for Americans to file their taxes. Today, we've got shares declining of both H&R Block and also of Intuit. Right now, H&R Block down 8.4%, Intuit lower by 5.5%. So again, recapping, S&P up 28, gain there of 0.5%. Bitcoin at a record. And for on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, got it. Charlie, thank you so much. All right, folks, Ukrainian forces carried out their first strike on a border region in Russia using Western-supplied missiles as President Vladimir Putin approved and updated a nuclear doctrine expanding the conditions for using atomic weapons. It was the first known attack following that decision by President Biden's administration, the U.S. administration, to approve Kyiv's limited use of the weapons to hit targets inside Russia, coming 2 months, as you know, before President-elect Donald Trump takes over, promising to, I guess, quickly end the war, although I keep hearing about escalation, Tim.
The crisis continues, perhaps escalating, as the G20 summit of world leaders gets ready to wrap up today in Rio de Janeiro. And another crisis averted as the family photo has been redone. Watching it all from the sidelines and front and center, Bloomberg News correspondent and host of the Big Take podcast, David Gura, on the ground at the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro. David, 4 p.m. in Rio, top of mind for us has been the war between Russia and Ukraine. Moscow's new nuclear doctrines, Russia's foreign minister saying the attacks by Ukraine using U.S.-made missiles to strike Russia overnight signal that the U.S. wants escalation. What are you hearing from the front on the ground?
Does it feel stressful out there?
Yeah, we'll get to that. It does. We'll get to that family photo in just a little bit, but let's start with how this news sort of reverberated throughout the summit and began very early this morning. So as you mentioned, the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov of the Russian Federation, came out early and did a press availability, talked to reporters. Most of that was in the Russian language, but he reserved the final few minutes to speak in English, and the audience here were the leaders of Western countries. And so he delivered that assessment. This was an escalation of the war in Ukraine, this move for the U.S. allowing those weapons to be used on Russian territory. And he also had a very stern warning to those Western leaders as well. He urged them to read that new nuclear doctrine. And this is basically the way that Russia thinks about when it might use nuclear weapons. So the change that they've made, that country has made, is if a non-nuclear power, which Ukraine is one, were to use weapons to attack Russia in concert with a nuclear power, here that would be the United States, Russia would have grounds to retaliate. So that's a pretty extraordinary move and pretty heated rhetoric from the Russian foreign minister. Now, we waited to see how that would play out, what kind of response we would get from the Americans, and we had a National Security Council official telling Bloomberg News that the U.S. plans to make no changes to its own nuclear doctrine. So as all of this has unfolded over these last few days, you see the U.S. trying to infuse a bit of calm into this, but it's certainly something that's occupied a lot of time and attention and interest from these world leaders here on the final day of this summit. And there have been, as I said, a lot of these bilateral meetings. A big one was between the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and President Xi Jinping. Olaf Scholz had spoken with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, in recent days. So President Xi, like so many world leaders here, eager to sit down with the German Chancellor to get a better sense of what he heard from the Russian president, what might be an off-ramp in this crisis in Ukraine at a time when it seems like things might be speeding kind of full speed ahead in a different direction.
David, these nuclear doctrines, changes, no changes, escalation, not escalation, is it just verbal jockeying? Is it just verbal threats? Or is it something that the world should kind of sit up a little bit straighter and take notice?
I think it's the latter, but if you listen to the Americans and how they view this, what they're saying is, look, this is to be expected. There has been this conversation swirling around the war in Ukraine for a long time. Kyiv has been adamant that other Western countries supply them with better, more sophisticated weaponry, and because of that, Russia was likely to make this kind of change to its nuclear doctrine. So I wouldn't say that it's business as usual here, but it's something that I think the U.S. is telegraphing is kind of expected. They expected this to happen, and what's happening is it's in the crucible of what we've seen over these last few days, which is this escalation of rhetoric. We saw the big attack from Russia on Ukraine just a couple of days ago. Obviously, this announcement by the U.S., this announcement the U.S. has allowed those weapons to be used is one that sort of ratcheted things up even more. But the U.S., again, playing this as though this is something that was kind of preordained or destined to happen here in light of what's been going on over these last few months, Carol.
All right, so my understanding, I think I heard you earlier on Bloomberg Television, or maybe it was on Balance of Power, that Joe Biden headed home or has left. Where are we in these meetings, right? They're wrapping up, and I guess, is there kind of a net narrative, net takeaway from all of this?
They are wrapping up. Joe Biden is making his way back to the United States after the conclusion of this summit. There are still some press availabilities and meetings that are taking place. And I should say President Xi is traveling to Brasilia after this for a day of meetings with President Lula here of Brazil. So there are leaders who are staying in this continent and having meetings and conversations about trade relationships and other deals going forward. I think the broad takeaway from this is that we've seen kind of a traditional G20 unfolding here, at least on paper. We hit all the agenda items that you'd expect to see at a big multilateral meeting like this on issues of trade and climate and development financing. But we've seen this big event kind of overarching it. And I think this concern about sort of where things are headed, particularly with the conflict in Ukraine, to an extent with the conflict in the Middle East as well, and this massive variable, Carol, that's just looming large here, which is what's going to change in a couple months' time. Joe Biden had this diminished role here at this summit, tried to make the most of it, tried to sort of spell out the contours of his legacy, convince a lot of these global partners that there's some policy foundation in place here that could stabilize the global systems going into this next president. But he's aware, all the people here are aware that come January 20th, a lot of that's likely to go out the window.
And I should point out that a little bit later on in our next hour, we're going to check in with Angela Stent, someone who's been also another go-to to us on the Russia-Ukraine war. She was a national intelligence officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council, and she has done a deep, deep study into Vladimir Putin. So a little bit more coming up in our 3 p.m. hour.
Yeah, that happening right at the top of the hour. David, perhaps that's a good place, a good segue to get to the family photo, which we talked about earlier, and we talked a little bit about yesterday. And it's sort of a lighthearted thing, but also at the same time, it's very symbolic, and there's a lot of meaning that happens, especially with the transition that's happening right now. What's an update there?
Yeah, it is a huge part of these events, and so there was some embarrassment on the Brazilians' part that this happened, at least publicly, and what we heard from President Lula is this is Joe Biden's last G20. It would not be fitting for him to go home without that memento, without that formal photograph of him with these other leaders here at the G20. So after lunchtime here in Rio, they brought everybody back. They took that photograph. It's funny, you can see President Biden there flanked by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who were also absent from that photograph yesterday. They kind of looked like chastened school children in the class photo. They're there now. The photograph does exist. There was some speculation yesterday. Was something amiss? Was there something greater than President Biden just being late for that photograph? Did he not want to be depicted with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister? Both sides trying to put those rumors to rest. Seems like it was just a scheduling snafu here, but one they definitely wanted to rectify before Joe Biden made his way back to Washington.
We all definitely have our family photo stories to tell. Hey, just one last question. Is this a new era for the G20, David?
I think that that's likely to be the case. I mean, something we were watching here are the way that these countries are interacting with one another. This is an alliance group that was born out of a U.S. and Canadian desire to get these countries together. The U.S. has always had this kind of marquee role at the vanguard of this gathering, getting folks together. I think that it's likely going forward, in light of what we've heard from former President, now future President Trump, who really doesn't prefer these multilateral gatherings, like things to be done on a bilateral basis, that the shape, the contours of the G20 are going to be different going forward. It'll be interesting to see sort of how this shakes out when they meet again next year in South Africa.
David, I'm just going to say great work. Great checking in with you. You are, I guess, almost done. That beach, I've been on it. It's a really nice place to hang for a little while and read a book. So just some
He's got a lot more work to do, just so you know.
I'm sure he does. I'm sure he does. Bloomberg News correspondent David Gora there in Rio de Janeiro at the G20. All right, we're going to stay, though, on the war between Ukraine and Russia.
We're going to head to London now, where we find Bloomberg Opinion international affairs columnist Mark Champion, who writes, quote, "No matter how galling politically, the Biden administration and other NATO allies should be doing all they can to prepare for and, in reality, help President-elect Trump so that he's dealt the hand he needs to win genuine peace between Russia and Ukraine." Mark's story and more from Bloomberg Opinion on the Bloomberg terminal and at Bloomberg.com/opinion. The concept of strategic defeat as we get to the 1,000th day of this conflict, Mark. How do you view strategic defeat, and who are the people who are looking like they're going to be defeated?
Yeah, well, a little while in this conflict, you had, various Western leaders, including the then NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, talking about how Russia was being delivered a strategic defeat. And that seems to have really stuck in Vladimir Putin's craw. And he is constantly bringing it up. He brought it up recently at a big speech he made at something called the Valdai Forum, an annual forum run for the Kremlin. And he talked there about, how dare, people talk about a strategic defeat of Russia. And he loves this kind of way of framing the war in Ukraine, because it then is a war not about him invading another country, but it's a war about him and the West, and in, a struggle in which there's an aggressive West, and he is, pushing back and asserting Russian interests. So, but what we're really seeing is, the risk at this point of a strategic defeat for the West. Essentially, they have, put their bet down in Ukraine. They've said that, and correctly, in my view, they've said that we need to defend the sanctity of borders in Europe, and this is being challenged. We need to lay a marker. What we're seeing at the moment was, for a while, Western unity really surprised Putin. And the fact that the West was willing to send significant amounts of weapons was a big surprise for him. At this point, though, that Western unity is starting to sort of shiver. And so I actually think that, the sort of nuclear issues that you were talking about, the saber rattling on Putin's part, I actually think that that is part of this. For him, if he can frame the next few months in terms of, do you want a nuclear Armageddon, with Russia, or do you want to settle Ukraine on my terms? If he can get that framing for the debate, he's in a very good position.
I guess what's also important, and I'm just, as we went through your column reading in, is that it sounds like there's a lot of leaders jockeying to be the one who put an end to this war. But it's not just about putting an end to the war. It's, as you said earlier, creating a resolution so that Ukraine can move forward without fear of another future Russian invasion.
Absolutely. We always have to remember this is the second invasion. There was one in 2014 when Russia took Crimea, annexed it, and began an insurgency that involved sending unbadged troops into eastern Ukraine. I was there at the time. There's an absolute nonsense what the Russians say about how that unfolded. It was very much a Russian operation. That was begun. There was a war. The Ukrainians were unable at that time. They had a very sort of weak military. They were unable to defend themselves, and they settled. There was a peace settlement that was organized by the French and the Germans. 8 years later, Putin decided that he wasn't getting what he wanted, so he invaded again. The Ukrainian, fear, almost certainty. I spent a lot of time in Ukraine over the last couple of years, And, that's one constant. The Ukrainians are absolutely certain that if they don't get a settlement that has absolute security for them, some kind of security guarantee, it could be NATO membership, it could be a sort of Israeli situation with, with their arm to the teeth. But unless they have something like that, it will just start over. Wherever the ceasefire line might be laid, at the time, it will just begin again.
The renewed nuclear threats coming from Russia, coming from Vladimir Putin, you've written about these before. How should Europe, how should the U.S., how should the world look at these renewed threats?
I think you should really think of it as, like they say with magicians, it's all about the diversion, the distraction. They get you to watch the left hand and do something with the right. It is very difficult for Putin actually to use his nuclear weapons, in Ukraine or elsewhere. It's very difficult to do. There's huge costs involved. And he has not done it for that reason. That hasn't changed. Nothing about that has changed. The ATACMS are not game-changing missiles. The fact that they're being used in one place rather than another is not game-changing. One really needs to sort of look under the hood and say, okay, if he's not actually going to escalate in nuclear terms, are there other ways? And he is already escalating in other ways. And you saw on Monday there were 2 undersea cables that mysteriously got cut. That's being investigated now. But the suspicion of the German defense minister and many others is that this was a response. The West is quite dependent on these cables. Russia is not. It's a land. It's a land country. Has very few cables, undersea cables that are vulnerable, and yet it has developed a small fleet of deep diving submarines that are able to get to cables and to monitor them and service them. And there's good reason why they've been doing that in the last few years. So, there will be there already is escalation. There will be escalation. It's just that the nuclear issue is a canard, and it is very much used and very successfully by the Russians. It has been used successfully by the Russians to limit what the U.S. in particular is willing to do, but also other NATO allies such as Germany.
So, Mark, just quickly, just got about 25, 30 seconds. So it's our third winter here now for the Russia-Ukraine war. So for Donald J. Trump, President-elect coming in, what is crucial that allies do here and set him up so that if it doesn't end soon, it ends at least when he's in the White House? And again, just got about 25, 30 seconds, quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So the key at the moment, Ukraine is very much on the back foot. Putin has absolutely no reason to negotiate rather than just demand terms of surrender. So the key is to change that situation so that once Trump arrives in office and he wants to solve it all in a day, you can pick the day, but essentially it's what you need is for the situation to be changed enough that Putin has reason to actually talk.
So appreciate it. I know it's later there in London. Mark Champion, Bloomberg Opinion International Affairs columnist. Coming up next, the nation's next U.S. Treasury Secretary. It's a big job. Who does it? It matters globally. This is Business Week.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Developing story headline right now off the Bloomberg Professional Service. President-elect Donald Trump has picked Howard Lutnick for Commerce Secretary. Again, story we're working, more details as they become available, but it is official. The President-elect has picked Howard Lutnick for Commerce Secretary. Right now, we have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 66 points. That is a drop of just about 0.1%. Volatile session. The S&P pushing higher, very close to session highs of 25 right now, up by about 0.4%. Nasdaq surging 181 points, up by 1%. Dow transports are down 0.4%, while the Russell 2000 index is up 0.6%. 10-year at 4.37%, the 2-year 4.26%. Gold up $18 the ounce, up 0.7%, 26.30. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.1%, 69.23 a barrel. Bitcoin trading at a record at 93,854, up by 2.72%. Walmart boosting its outlook for the year on strong demand from U.S. consumers searching for value. Walmart, after earnings, up by 4%. Rival Target, which reports tomorrow, lower by 0.6%. The New York Jets have fired GM Joe Douglas, and again, repeating our top story, President-elect Donald Trump has picked Howard Lutnick for Commerce Secretary. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Just a couple of days ago, he might have been, or rumored, could have been a Treasury pick, but it sounds like Donald Trump, President-elect, has made up his mind, and he wants Howard Lutnick to be Commerce Secretary of the
There it
United
is.
States. There
Yeah,
it is.
the names keep coming in.
I got to say,
One name that hasn't come in is Treasury Secretary, though. We're still waiting on that one.
it is said, though, that Trump's transition team is considering pairing Kevin Warsh, a former Fed official in that Treasury Secretary role, with hedge fund manager Scott Bessent as director of the White House's National Economic Council. This is according to folks familiar with the matter.
Standing by in our Washington, D.C. bureau with all the latest, we got Bloomberg News senior national political
It's like she
correspondent
knew a
Nancy
headline
Cook.
was going to come across.
I hope she's had time to, well, this has been widely thought, that,
Yes.
at least today. Howard Lutnick for Commerce Secretary. I think that's certainly a big part of this announcement, but it's also a big part that he's not going to be Treasury Secretary. Nancy, how should we look at this?
Yeah, I just want to correct some of the reporting that you've been talking about. They have not officially announced Howard Lutnick for Commerce Secretary. Our reporting shows that it's certainly trending that way, but there has been no official announcement from the campaign on that.
But, okay. I guess there was a post on Truth Social, right? That President Trump says he has chosen Lutnick as his nominee.
Maybe. I've been in the chair. I'm just talking about my reporting. I just want to make sure it's accurate.
No, that's fair. And I'm just going to Truth Social, and there is a statement from Donald Trump. I'm thrilled to announce that Howard Lutnick, Chairman and CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, will join my administration as the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. He will lead our tariff and trade agenda with additional direct responsibility for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And there's a little bit more in his bio. So just, I know this stuff is fast and furious, so I just wanted to share that with you. So what's the significance of this specific spot for him and not Treasury Secretary?
Well, I think that the spot that we're really watching is Treasury Secretary.
Yeah.
And our reporting shows that Trump is going to meet with Kevin Warsh, who is a former Fed governor, tomorrow. He is also supposed to meet with Mark Rowan of Apollo. And then also Senator Bill Hagerty is also in the mix now at this point for Treasury Secretary. So Lutnick getting the Commerce Secretary, I mean, it's still a huge position, still has a ton of power in the federal government, but it is not sort of the plum job that he had wanted. And you have to remember that he is in charge of the personnel for the transition and had basically sort of put himself up for the Treasury Secretary, much to the surprise of Trump himself. And there was a ton of infighting over the position last week. We reported that, Howard Lutnick was really going for it and lobbying and asking allies to call Trump and make the case for him. Scott Bessent was doing the same. Trump became very irritated with this and basically now is widening the search and looking for, a third party to fill that job.
Sometimes it just feels like kids in a sandbox playing. Nancy, one thing that we were thinking about in our coverage of who ultimately gets nominated, who ultimately sits in the seat of U.S. Treasury Secretary. I mean, it's a big job. It's Bloomberg's bread and butter. I feel it's like, we're constantly talking about what the Treasury Secretary of the United States is up to. Remind us about this position, what this Treasury Secretary does, why it's so important domestically and globally.
Well, Treasury Secretary just oversees a huge number of things. You have to remember that there are a number of tax cuts expiring in 2025. Obviously, that's something that a lot of Bloomberg readers care about. The Treasury Secretary will be intimately involved in that. Treasury is also in charge of, sanctions, which has been really important as the Middle East has been erupting. Also, it has a huge economic policy wing. It oversees the IRS. Just so many key functions. And I think that the Trump team really wants someone in there who has some gravitas on Wall Street and is someone who, gets along with Trump, but who can also really, appease the markets and send a signal to the markets that this is a serious person, who can really represent the country and also Republicans.
How important is somebody who agrees with the Trump administration's views on tariffs? And the reason I ask is because it's not necessarily seen universally on Wall Street as a good thing. So the folks who say tariffs are a good thing and also have the Wall Street credibility, there might not be that many of them.
Well, I think that if we, if the tariffs was the #1 criteria for Treasury Secretary, then Bob Lighthizer would have gotten the job.
Fair.
He was certainly in the mix for it. I think Trump really does want someone who is seen as a little bit more Wall Street friendly. And you have to remember, in his first term, he had an economic policy team that did not universally agree on trade and the tariffs. I covered all 4 years of that, and there were a ton of fights that played out in the Oval Office between Secretary Mnuchin, who was then the Treasury Secretary, Peter Navarro, who worked on trade, Robert Lighthizer, who worked on trade. They did not all agree, and I think Trump actually liked that. He liked that discussion and sort of fighting happening in front of him. And so I don't expect his economic team to sort of share universal views, all across the board.
Hey, one last question, 30 seconds here. So if it turns out to be Kevin Warsh, how might that be perceived globally? Is this kind of a more typical or usual choice?
I think so. I mean, he worked in one of the Bush White Houses. He's been a Fed governor. I've been told by people who know him, he's very diplomatic. He gets along well with people. And so I think that for Wall Street, this would be seen as sort of a more conventional and safe choice.
All right, good stuff. Nancy Cook, thank you so much. Bloomberg News senior national political correspondent Nancy Cook there in D.C. All right, from Washington to Wall Street we go.
Yeah, because Alphabet's Chrome browser could go for as much as $20 billion if a judge agrees to a Justice Department proposal to sell the business in what would be a historic crackdown on one of the world's biggest tech companies. The department will ask the judge who ruled in August that Google illegally monopolized the search market to require measures related to AI and its Android smartphone operating system. That's according to people familiar with the plans. Alphabet shares higher on the news?
Yeah, up 1 1/3%.
Okay.
So, help me.
I know someone who can help us and help explain it all. Bloomberg Intelligence senior tech industry analyst Mandeep Singh. He's here in the studio. Mandeep, good to have you. Why is this happening, and why are we seeing this market reaction?
I mean, look, Alphabet lost the case. We know that. And the judge will be hearing in April about the next steps and what they want to do in terms of remedies. The DOJ wants to propose a forced divestiture of Chrome, which is the browser that, Alphabet uses for distributing their search. So when it comes to why Alphabet is so dominant, I mean, it has to do with distribution. And the reason I say that is they own the operating system, Android, as well as Chrome is the most popular browser.
It's what I'm using right now.
Not only is their search good, they have the distribution, and not everyone has that. So, if you compare it to an OpenAI or other products that could be competing, they don't have the distribution that Alphabet has.
But here's the thing about, and maybe this is by design, the Google ecosystem, Chrome is an integral part of that.
Yeah.
When I log into this computer and I use the Chrome browser, I sign into my Google account, my Bloomberg Google account. So, and then across my different devices, it's all saved, the search history, the maps. Can you really peel this away from Google?
I don't think so, which is why I feel, even though, that's the structural remedy that is being suggested, it's very hard to implement in practice for the reason that you just described, that, if you're trying to figure out, okay, I take this part away, maybe Google has to syndicate their search results now, give away their click and query data, which underpins a lot of their search business. And, with Chrome as an entity doesn't make any money. So when you think about, the business model behind Chrome, it's a browser.
Who's going to want it?
With over 3 billion monthly active users. So very popular browser, but there is no business behind it.
Okay, but for Alphabet, is it, okay, no business behind it, but it collects a lot of data.
It does.
And we all know that's what we're living in. That's where the money comes from.
It's the family of apps. It's the same with Meta. The reason why Meta's ad targeting is so good is because they collect the data across the family of apps and then show you a targeted ad. It's the same with Google. And they collect data across their apps, Gmail, Maps, core Google search, Chrome browser. That's why their ad targeting is so much better than others.
So is the stock up because investors don't believe it's going to have to spin it off or whatever?
I think it's difficult to implement this structural remedy. I mean, the same thing happened with Microsoft back in 2000. They wanted to split the browser business from the operating system, and Office, and Microsoft appealed against it and they won.
So is that the next move here for Alphabet?
If the judge says that he wants Alphabet to sell their Chrome business, first thing is, who is a potential buyer?
Yeah.
Because when it comes to big tech, they can make an acquisition like this.
Also, if you're, okay, so let's say it does, let's play this out a little bit. Let's say Alphabet is able to sell this, then what would stop them from creating a new browser within the Android operating ecosystem or something that's part of the Google suite of apps that then essentially replaces Chrome and does all the things that it does and still has that integration?
I mean, why would they get into browser business when they're being asked to sell their, core business to begin with? So I think building it from scratch would be a tough endeavor.
Maybe that's why I'm not the CEO of the company.
No, but still a good question.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm wondering, does any of this matter? Does a Trump administration change potentially whether or not, or something's got to happen off of this?
No, I think there will be a new attorney general. We will find out over the course of the next few weeks. And look, the vice president-elect has been very clear. He doesn't like the clout that big tech has.
So regardless of who the new attorney general is, it's likely someone who's not a huge fan of big tech.
I don't think so with this upcoming administration, especially Alphabet and Meta.
So how do you think they're adjusting to it?
Well, I mean, from an Alphabet's perspective, they want to be very objective here with the remedies. What are the things they can do at their end? I mentioned about syndicating the search results. That creates a level playing field for anybody who wants to use, the data that they are collecting and improve their search. And I think at the likes of OpenAI or Anthropic or even Microsoft Bing, they will find that to be an attractive proposition, getting that click data from Google as an API to use it in their own search.
Right, there's a whole food chain, right, that plays off of it and taps into that data. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Mandeep Singh, he's Senior Tech Industry Analyst at our Bloomberg Intelligence team, joining us right here in studio. Shares of Alphabet, they're up 1 1/3% here.
Guarantee you a winner in this.
Who?
The lawyers. Always. They're going to be very busy. Those billable hours.
You still got to figure it out, right?
You still got to figure it out.
All right, Alphabet, I got to say, not among the top holdings of our next guest, and yet, who cares? He's been beating the pack for the past 5 years, finding gems among the small and mid-cap universe. He joins us next.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. President-elect Donald Trump makes it official. He is tapping Cantor Fitzgerald CEO Howard Lutnick to lead the Commerce Department, a central pick in an administration that will likely be shaped by sweeping tariff hike proposals. The Dow trading lower, down 165 points, a decline of 0.4%. S&P up 12, up 0.2%, while NASDAQ is up 140, a gain of 0.7%. 10-year 4.38%, with the 2-year 4.26%. Stocks higher in a volatile session that's been marked by geopolitical headlines. Right now we have got gold up $18, $26.30 the ounce, up 0.7%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.3%, $69.39 a barrel. And Bitcoin trading at a record 93,788 for Bitcoin. That is a gain of 2.6%. Lowe's shares are lower, down 4%, extending its streak of declining sales during the third quarter as it continued to feel the ripple effects of a weak housing market. Rival Home Depot also down today, dropping by 0.7%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. I gotta say, it's safe to say it feels like there's a new narrative going on, man, because lots of folks are coming on to talk small caps and how now is their time.
I feel like this week we've already had 3 people talking small caps, and it's only Tuesday.
Makes me a little nervous, but then we've got... It does, because when everybody's kind of piling in, I'm like, wait a minute.
But look at what's happened over the last 10 years. I mean, small caps have underperformed mega caps.
And this next guest
large caps.
Likes mid caps, likes small caps, and has an impressive long-term track record to go along.
Yeah, we got with us Ryan Kelly, Chief Investment Officer and Portfolio Manager at Hennessy Funds. Ryan co-manages the Hennessy Cornerstone Mid Cap 30 Fund. Its return on average nearly 24% annually. Carol, it puts the fund in the 98th percentile, so beating pretty much just about everyone in the sector. That's according to Bloomberg data.
That's a flick. You can do that. All right, Ryan joining us here in studio. Hey, so good to have you back with us. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me again.
Well, it's great to have you here. We do want to talk about what's in the fund. You just recently finished up a rebalancing. You do it once a year. But I want to ask you, is there anything in the macro environment, the outcome of the elections, that has shaped maybe where you wanted to invest for the coming year?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things going on here. Just getting back to the small and mid versus large.
Yeah.
You know, there's so much of that debate out there. So much of the large cap stocks are just dominated by the Magnificent Seven.
Still.
And Nvidia, you know, reporting tomorrow. You know, so far this year, 25% of the S&P's returns have been from Nvidia. So one stock doing that much good, and maybe sometimes that much damage to one particular index is a lot. So we like the small and mid cap space because it's not as susceptible to a lot of, you know, there's not mega caps that'll take over the index. It's trading at a better valuation. Certainly some changes that are supposedly upcoming with less regulation, better corporate tax rate. That's going to benefit some of these companies as well.
Tariff policy?
Tariff policy could actually eat into some of their earnings for some of these mid-cap stocks.
What's of those things you mentioned, what's actually priced in right now in your view? And we'll talk about some of these individual names soon, but the administration is in transition.
Yes.
So we know the makeup of Congress pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think they'll be able to get done? So therefore, what is priced in?
It's a very tough question. I would say that tariffs are not completely priced in because I think there's still a disbelief that we could get to some of the levels that have been talked about. I think that personally would be very detrimental to the economy overall, and I hope that sort of more level heads come up with maybe a better plan. Mm-hmm. But if that is the case, we're getting the kind of tariffs we're talking about, that really could hurt, I think, some of the longer-term earnings of some of these companies.
All right, let's get to it, because I want to talk names. Your fund is up 37% year-to-date, 98th percentile. You've had a great 5 years for the fund as well. You pretty much are beating your peers. So kudos. We like to talk to people who perform. Your strategy, it's a 1-year rebalance. You reminded me when you sat down here in our studio, you just finished a rebalance. Tell us about that rebalance. There's 30 names, and you said only 2 have stayed in the portfolio from the past year.
Yeah, so what we do is we really want to make sure that we're just going to continue to follow the same formula year in and year out. So this fund is 21 years old. It has been done the exact same way since inception. We use a very disciplined process. That's actually on our website. You guys could go look at it.
Yeah.
Every viewer could go look at it. The formula is listed there on how we do it. But the idea is that once a year, we'll look at all the portfolio, and we'll look at the universe of stocks out there. And we
It's
really,
a lot to look at.
It's a lot, and so it's a quantitative based, it's a formula based.
It is.
Fund.
Okay.
But it's based on fundamentals going back for many, many, many decades. When this was first put together, they looked back at 3-4 decades worth of data to see what really works on Wall Street. And so what we do is we look for companies in the 1 to 10 billion market cap range. We look for a low price to sales, which is an interesting metric because most people use PE or EV to EBITDA or whatever. We look for a low price to sales of less than 1.5 times.
So it almost thinks about some valuation that hasn't been recognized, right, as a result.
A lot of times
of the top line.
You'll get companies that are